National parks are supposed to be a place of relaxation, beauty, and fun, of course. And they usually are. But the key word there is usually. Unfortunately, on albeit rare occasions, visitors to national parks run into trouble. Now, sometimes they make it out of this trouble completely unscathed, and other times, well, they don't. Sometimes they just simply vanish into the wilderness, never to be seen again, or to be found years later when it's far too late. Hell, sometimes this even happens to park rangers, literally those who are tasked with protecting the park and its visitors. More on that later. I've covered numerous national park mysteries and murders on my channel, and so today I've decided to combine them all into one marathon compilation. But to start off, I wanted to give you a brand new, incredible update on a story that I covered last year, which I titled The Most Horrific Crime in National Park History. I'm going to start by giving you a quick recap of that story. So, in May of 1996, Julie Williams and Lolly Winans headed down to Virginia's Shenandoah National Park to go backpacking on the Appalachian Trail and the surrounding trails in the wilderness. I'm sure that the start of their trip was quite peaceful. I've been to Shenandoah myself. It's absolutely beautiful. And also, since both of these women were from up north, it's no surprise that they chose this particular park as the location for their late spring hike. But as peaceful as it might have started, the end of their hike was anything but. So they're out there for a while, and Julie Williams' father became concerned when he didn't hear from his daughter. He actually contacted the authorities, and he reported the woman missing. He felt as though she was still in the park somewhere, and he was right, because eventually investigators found a wooded campsite which was only about a half mile away from the girls' parked vehicle, and in this campsite they discovered what would go on to be one of, if not the most horrific crime scenes in all of national park history. So Julie Williams and Lolly Winans were both in their mid-20s and had actually begun a romantic relationship together after meeting through a nonprofit organization that they had been working with. So they take this trip to Shenandoah National Park, and then after a few days of hiking and exploring, the two women made camp at a spot near a stream that was just off of the bridle trail, about a quarter mile away from Skyline Drive, and about a half mile from where their car was parked at Skyland Lodge. It's also worth mentioning that this spot was in very close proximity to the Appalachian Trail. But then something happened. And on June 1st, 1996, rangers found the lifeless bodies of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans at this very same campsite. I mean, it was an incredibly violent scene, one that I don't really feel comfortable describing in detail, honestly, especially out of respect to the victims. But I mean, it was just brutal from what I read. All I'm gonna say is that Lolly's body was found inside the tent, and Julie's body, along with some of her camping gear, I guess, was found further down an embankment, roughly 30 feet away from the campsite. I mean, just a horrific discovery, and this naturally marked the beginning of the investigation into what happened and obviously who had carried out such a violent attack on the two innocent hikers. So in my previous video about this case, I talked about a man named Darrell Rice, who was initially suspected to have committed these murders. In fact, he was even indicted for them, with prosecutors believing that he targeted the women because of their sexual orientation. But eventually, the charges against him were dropped, apparently because DNA from a hair that was found at the crime scene would go on, to be tested, and then turns out it didn't match the DNA of Darrell Rice. And so this case quickly went cold, and for literal decades, nobody knew who had carried out the murders of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans. So that's essentially a condensed version of the story I told in my video last year. But just a few weeks ago, my phone started getting absolutely blown up. Both comments on that video and other videos. I was getting emails, I was getting messages on Instagram, so many of you sent me links to the articles stating that this case, after like 30 years or something like that, had finally been solved. So here's what happened. Using the FBI's combined DNA index system, investigators were able to match DNA recovered at the crime scene to that of a man named Walter Leo Jackson Sr. Jackson was a known criminal with tons of charges throughout the years, including things like kidnappings, assaults, and some even more disgusting stuff that I can't even say on here so that YouTube doesn't punish me for using certain words. The FBI described this man, Jackson, as a, quote, avid hiker, which is something I describe myself as, and so that makes me not feel great. And he was apparently known to visit Shenandoah National Park somewhat frequently, despite the fact that I'm pretty sure he was from Ohio. I guess I'm not exactly sure where he's from, but I do know that he died in Ohio. He died there in prison in 2018, which means that he will unfortunately never be held responsible for his disgusting crimes against Williams and Winans. I think it's pretty crazy that the FBI were able to determine that he was responsible for the murders, like I said, just about 30 years later. And it honestly makes me really curious about what other cases I've covered on the channel that are eventually gonna go on to be solved like this. May Julie Williams and Lolly Winans rest in peace, and I hope that this recent development in the case is able to give their friends and family at least a little bit of closure. So that's obviously a very disturbing case despite this recent development. And folks, we have a couple hours of mostly, I'm going to say, disturbing stuff that you're going to be watching here. And so why don't we take a quick little break from that? I'm actually going to change my shirt here in a second, and we're going to try to keep it fun and light for just a second here and tell you about Aura. Aura is the sponsor of this video. So have you guys ever wondered why you get so many spam calls and spam texts, things like that? Like, how the hell are these spammers finding your number? Well, I can tell you one of the reasons, and it's because big companies can't keep your data safe. For example, take Ticketmaster, everyone's favorite company, right? They were recently hacked, and this led to the data of 560 million. You heard that right. 560 million of their users' data being put up for sale on the dark web. I'm talking things like street addresses, phone numbers, hell, even credit card data. And the worst part about all of this, by the way, is that Ticketmaster isn't really doing anything about it. I said I would keep things light here, but I guess this is actually pretty dark too. So many companies out there today are like super quick to collect your data, and then they do absolutely nothing to protect it. And so this is where our sponsor Aura comes in. Aura will actually alert you when your data has been leaked onto the dark web, or if someone tries to access your credit or your bank accounts. And they will also remove your personal information from data broker websites, which is going to result in less of those annoying and malicious spam texts and calls. And also, I mean, who wants their private information available on the internet for anyone to see? Aura will get that stuff off the internet, and the benefits don't stop there either. Aura is actually going to provide you with a ton of other important online security tools, such as a VPN, an antivirus, a password manager, and so much more. I could go on and on about this. And by the way, normally if you want to get all of those services, you have to like pay for them, download them, and manage them all in separate apps. But with Aura, you get all of that stuff, plus tons of other things like identity theft insurance, for instance, just in one app and for one affordable price. So with that said, you can either continue to leave yourself and your family, mind you, vulnerable to data breaches, or you can head over to aura.com/KyleHatesHiking and get yourself a 14-day free trial. You can also click the link right at the top of the description. One more time, aura.com/KyleHatesHiking. Go get that free trial, and you'll also be massively supporting the channel if you click that link, by the way. I really appreciate it. And so with that said, buckle up, folks, because now we've got a lot more national park mysteries and murders to cover. Let's get back into it. For most people, visiting a national park is a relaxing, fun adventure. But for the 3 people I'm going to tell you about today, their national park trip became a death trap. And pardon my language here, the most fucked up part about these stories is that they all remain unsolved to this day. None of these people have been seen alive in years, and 2 of them haven't even been seen dead either. From a man who left a disturbing note at the most popular trailhead of the most popular national park in the entire United States and then disappeared, to a high school girl who vanished on a hiking trail despite the fact that she was within eyesight of her classmates at the time. I'm telling you, these stories won't be leaving your mind anytime soon, and so you've been warned. And I'm not just going to be telling you these stories, by the way. I'm also going to be highlighting the plethora of unanswered questions that surround each of these cases. And so, without further ado, I invite you on a virtual trip to perhaps the most beautiful national park on the entire East Coast of the United States. That would be Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Now, I'm bringing you on this trip for free, but if you're a repeat viewer of the channel, you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission. And if this is your first time watching, then welcome, and you can cover your admission by leaving a comment down below, letting me know what you think of these 3 stories. On March 15th, 2012, a phone call was made to the parents of 24-year-old Derek Luking, and folks, this was not your ordinary phone call. This was the type of phone call that every parent has nightmares about receiving. It was their son's roommate calling them to say that their son Derek had gone missing. Derek had strangely not stopped his alarm clock from going off in the morning for like a long time, and soon after that, he failed to show up at work. Nobody had any idea where Derek was, and so his parents immediately began driving through the night from their home in Virginia down to Louisville, Tennessee, where Derek lived at the time. It had been determined that the last time Derek was seen was on the previous day, that would be March 14th, when he left his home. When his parents finally arrived, they started looking through Derek's computer, and they discovered that he had been researching the nearby Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and that he had made a hotel reservation just outside of the park for the night of March 16th. That just so happened to be the same date that they were looking through his computer, and so his parents were fresh on his tail, but by the time they reached the hotel, it was unfortunately too late. Derek was spotted on surveillance cameras leaving the hotel in Cherokee, North Carolina around 4 a.m. on March 17th. His parents were able to get access to his hotel room, and when they entered it, they found a Bible and a bottle of liquor left on the floor. After leaving the hotel, Derek's parents began driving west back to Tennessee in order to continue their search. They reached the North Carolina-Tennessee state line at Newfound Gap, deep inside Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And there's a little parking lot and like lookout there, and the state line crosses right down the middle of it. When Derek's parents pulled into the parking lot right there on the state border, they accidentally spotted a clue that would soon change everything in the search for Derek Luking. When Derek's parents pulled into the parking lot at Newfound Gap, they were shocked by what they saw. Sitting there right on the state border between North Carolina and Tennessee was Derek's vehicle, his white Ford Escape. But Derek himself was unfortunately nowhere to be found. The discovery of Derek's vehicle came at roughly 8:30 a.m. on March 17th, and you'll recall that Derek was spotted on camera leaving the hotel that very same day at 4 a.m. According to my calculations, i.e. my Google Mapsing, Newfound Gap is roughly a 33-minute drive away from the hotel that Derek stayed at. And this means that his parents arrived at his car only about 4 hours after he would have parked it, which is just astonishing. I'm generalizing here, but in most missing person cases, entire days go by before anyone realizes that the person was missing, let alone knows their last location. But in this case, his parents arrived at his point last known, only 4 hours after he had been there. I'm sure that Derek's parents hoped that he had simply gone hiking. It was a trailhead that he was parked at after all, and they hoped that he would return within a few hours. But after they looked inside his car, they became extremely worried and immediately contacted rangers to start a search. Derek had apparently gone out and purchased over $1,000 worth of camping, hiking, and survival equipment in the days leading up to his disappearance. And by the way, remember, that's a 2012 $1,000, not a 2024 $1,000. I mean, that's a lot of expensive equipment, and yet for some unknown reason, Derek didn't take all of it with him when he presumably set out into the wilderness from Newfound Gap. Derek's family wrote, quote, "We believe he had at least a backpack, a waterproof watch, a Bear Grylls survival tool pack, including a multi-tool, small flashlight, fire starter rod, a Gerber pack axe, several pages of a military survival manual, a knife sharpener, a compass/thermometer, 100 feet of black parachute cord, a headlamp, pocket knife, iPod Touch, and some granola bars." And so clearly he did take a lot of gear with him, but he apparently did not take a tent, a sleeping bag, or his wallet and car keys. And the reason we know that he didn't take those items is because, well, they were found inside the car. The fact that he didn't take those items was a very bizarre sign, but it wasn't anywhere as bizarre as the next thing that they found inside Derek's car. This next discovery is one of the most puzzling and honestly disturbing twists to this entire story. Derek Luking left a note inside his car which read, quote, "Don't look for me." The note was not addressed to anybody specifically, so it was unclear if it was meant for Derek's friends and family, or perhaps if it was meant for park rangers in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. But either way, this was an incredibly eerie sign and more than enough needed to justify a search. In the weeks that followed, park employees, rangers, volunteers, and ridge runners combed the trails surrounding Newfound Gap looking for any additional clues related to Derek's disappearance. Hundreds and hundreds of miles were hiked, much of which was done with tracking dogs, by the way. I mean, helicopters were brought in for multiple days, even once to search at night. Over 3,000 missing person flyers were handed out in the national park, and yet, despite this incredible effort, no sign of Derek Luking was found. Absolutely nothing whatsoever. And if you flash forward 11 years later, this is unfortunately still where Derek's case stands. There haven't been any updates, any signs of him, and it's really just gone cold. I have a lot of unanswered questions about this case. First of all, I've been to Newfound Gap before. The Appalachian Trail crosses right over it, and so I hiked through it on my AT through hike. And there's also a bunch of other trails that start and intersect Newfound Gap as well. I'm saying this to illustrate that it's a very popular area. There's all that hiking traffic, certainly, and then the road also goes right through Newfound Gap. There's that scenic overlook and parking lot there, and it also sits right on the border of North Carolina and Tennessee. And so all this stuff makes Newfound Gap an extremely popular place. I don't know this for a fact, but I would be willing to bet that Newfound Gap is probably the most popular trailhead in all of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And on that note, I should also mention that Great Smoky Mountains National Park is the #1 most visited national park in the entire United States. Now again, Derek was there early in the morning when he parked. I think it's important to remember that, but I don't know, it's weird. Like, how the hell did he show up to the most popular trailhead in the country's most popular national park, walk into the woods, and not be seen or noticed by anybody? Again, I guess it's certainly possible, but it's just bizarre to me. And another question I have is, why did he buy so much expensive gear just to leave a lot of it behind in his car? And perhaps the biggest question of all is, what the hell could have happened to Derek Luking? There's a few different theories floating around out there about, what could have happened. The first of which is that he deliberately went off trail into the woods in an ill-fated attempt at solo survival. Derek Luking was apparently a fan of the TV show Man vs. Wild, which features survival expert Bear Grylls. I'm sure many of us have seen it. Derek's family believed that it was possible that he actually set off into the woods from Newfound Gap, attempting to mimic the TV show, and then he died in the process. This theory would explain why Derek wasn't spotted on any of the hiking trails in the area. I guess he would have taken an off-trail route to do this. It would also explain why he left behind the tent and the sleeping bag in the car. Perhaps he was planning on building his own shelter or something like that, but it still doesn't explain why he bought that stuff in the first place. Perhaps he just changed his mind last minute. Another theory is that Derek Luking set off into the wilderness somewhere and then took his own life. This would be consistent with the bizarre note that he left in his car, as well as apparently some of his behavior leading up to his disappearance. Derek's father was quoted saying he, referring to Derek, started drinking a little bit and smoking cigarettes, which was highly unusual for him. He wasn't happy with his job or where his life was going. But if Derek had planned to just walk off into the woods and then take his own life, then why did he buy all of that survival gear beforehand? It should also be mentioned that theories of foul play are always a possibility in a missing persons case like this. Now, I'm not aware of any evidence that Derek was kidnapped or killed, but until we know what happened to him, we can't really rule this theory out. It's such a bizarre and sad case. I don't know. Leave a comment down below and let me know what you think of all of this. And of course, anyone with information about Derek Luking's disappearance should call investigative services with the National Park Service at the phone number I have in the description. My heart goes out to Derek and of course his family, and I really hope they get some answers soon, and I hope that by talking about his story, it'll shed some more light on his case, and that, yeah, maybe one day his family will know what happened. The family of the victim in our next national park mystery did eventually get not all, but some answers about their loved one's disappearance, unlike Derek Luking. But unfortunately, the answers that they got were not very good. In August of 1996, Sheila Kearns needed a fresh start. The 43-year-old had previously been married and had apparently paid her husband's way through medical school. But once she had paid everything off, Sheila's husband apparently just up and left the marriage. It's unclear to me exactly what Sheila Kearns did immediately after her divorce, but by the summer of 1996, I know that she found her way to Mount Rainier National Park in Washington State. It's here that she got a job working at the front desk of the Paradise Inn, which sits on the southern slopes of Mount Rainier and is within the boundaries of the national park. Though little is publicly known about Sheila's past, one of her former co-workers recalled Sheila mentioning that she had spent some time in the Peace Corps, and also she mentioned the heartbreaking story of her former marriage. This coworker affirmed that Sheila Kearns wanted a fresh start at her life, and that's why she took the job in the beautiful national park. And this makes sense to me. I'm sure it does to you as well. What better way to start over than by living and working in the kind of place that a lot of people only get to visit once in a lifetime? On October 1st, 1996, the Paradise Inn closed for the season. The crowds of fair weather tourists had long since passed, and though the park was still open, it was now much, much quieter. There would be far less people around to potentially notice anything out of the ordinary. But just because the inn was closing and the crowds were thinning out, that did not mean that all the park employees were just done for the season. There was still work to be done, and thus Sheila Kearns, who had recently been hired on for the winter crew, by the way, remained in the park. She began the process of moving into a new employee housing building, and she also attended some end-of-the-season parties thrown by some of her fellow employees. One of these parties took place on October 4th, 1996. Sheila Kearns went to the party. I'm assuming she had a good time, and then she left, and she was never seen alive ever again after this. 2 days later, on October 6th, Sheila Kearns failed to show up for work. Now, this was highly unusual for her, and it really concerned her coworkers, one of whom actually went to her residence hoping that they would find her there. But unfortunately, Sheila wasn't there, and her residence revealed no additional clues about where she could have been either. Nothing was out of the ordinary, and there was certainly no sign of a struggle. A search was immediately launched in the park, which consisted of dozens of park rangers, many of whom were using search dogs, by the way. Sheila's car was also searched and investigated, which revealed no additional clues, just like her residence had. Her apartment and her car were both completely undisturbed. Investigators initially believed that Sheila, who was an avid hiker apparently, had gotten lost on one of the many remote trails nearby in the park, but after 3 days of intense searching, investigators ended up scaling back the search, and they unfortunately started to change their tune. They now believed that Sheila Kearns had been abducted. After the search was halted, the case basically went cold. I mean, it literally went cold. Winter set in, which complicated the matter even more. But then, as the snow melted the following spring, it revealed a very disturbing sight. On May 10th, 1997, a park volunteer found skeletal remains scattered around a 300-yard area near the Longmire campground, which was within the national park. The location of these remains was roughly 1 mile away from the Paradise Inn where Sheila had been working. Dental records were used to confirm that the remains did in fact belong to Sheila Kearns, and by this point it was also made public that her death was likely a result of homicide. Because this occurred inside the national park, the FBI was in charge of bringing the killer to justice or figuring out what had happened. They interviewed multiple people that were possible suspects, but everybody that they interviewed was cleared. The case quickly went cold once again, and it's unfortunately remained unsolved ever since it happened. It's now been about 28 years since Sheila Kearns was presumably killed. So this brings us to the unanswered questions portion of this story. And by the way, if you have a potential answer to any of these questions that I pose in any of these stories, by the way, be sure to leave a comment and let me know what you think. The first unanswered question that I have is, how did her remains go undetected for so long? I ask this question because I'm a little bit suspicious of the location where her remains were found. It would have been one thing if they found her like miles into the backcountry. Like that would make sense if it took a while to find her there, but that's not what happened. Her remains were found very close to a well-used front country campground and some buildings there. And again, it was only a mile away from where she had been working. I don't know, during the 3-day search that followed her disappearance, before any of the snow and the weather, that's my understanding anyways, it just really perplexes me how they didn't discover her remains. Now, there's not very much information available about this case, unfortunately, so it's definitely possible that I'm just missing something obvious here, but I don't know, unless we learn more, I am really, really puzzled by this. The next unanswered question I have is this. Is it possible that Sheila was not killed by a human, but rather by an animal like maybe a bear or a cougar? The FBI has never indicated that they even came close to finding a suspect in her murder, so maybe it's possible, yeah, that she wasn't even murdered at all. The fact that her remains were so like scattered and not in one exact place could also potentially suggest that an animal was responsible. But then again, no evidence that this was the case has been found either. And I can't help but think that if there was a wild animal kind of roaming around near the park's buildings, one that was bold enough to attack a human, it seems likely to me that there would have been other sightings or encounters with this animal before or after Sheila was killed. And of course, this is a national park we're talking about, so I'm sure the employees sometimes saw animals, but I feel like there would have been repeated sightings of this same animal. But then again, I don't have much information about the case, so maybe that did happen and it just wasn't reported for some reason. I really don't know. FBI Special Agent Terry Postma, I'm not exactly sure, was quoted saying, maybe she, referring to Sheila, was attacked by a mountain lion or, some critter while she was out for a walk. There's also the theory that she was abducted and killed. This special agent also said, quote, just because a person was cleared in an investigation a number of years ago doesn't mean that new information might come to light which makes them a subject or suspect again. I don't know, guys. Leave a comment right now and let me know what you think might have happened. And of course, if you have any information about the unsolved mystery of Sheila Kearns, please contact the FBI. May she rest in peace, and my heart goes out to her friends, and of course, her family. For our next story, we're gonna go back to Great Smoky Mountains National Park. In fact, we're almost going back to the exact spot that Derek Luking went missing from, except this time we're gonna be visiting the park over 10 years before Luking was even born. On Friday, October 8th, 1976, a high school class of over 35 students took a field trip to Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Among them was 16-year-old Teresa Gibson, who went by the nickname Trenny, and also her friend Robert Simpson. Trenny and Robert shared a seat together in the back of the bus for the duration of the drive to the national park. The class arrived at the Clingman's Dome parking lot, which is the highest point in Great Smoky Mountains National Park and in the state of Tennessee, by the way. They arrived at Clingman's Dome right around noon, and they began a hike to the summit of Andrews Bald along the Forney Ridge Trail. Now, if the names Andrews Bald and Forney Ridge Trail sound familiar to you, it might be because I actually covered another case that happened on the exact same trail in a previous video, which was the case of Susan Clemens. Now, these two cases are unrelated, but it is bizarre that they both happened on the same section of the same trail. I'll link that video above if you want to watch that one. The weather on October 8th was rainy and cold, and since the group was starting from the literal highest point in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, I can imagine that it was a pretty unpleasant day to be in the mountains. That didn't stop the high schoolers, however. They were instructed by the only teacher on the trip to hike the 1.8 miles to Andrews Bald and return to the Clingman's Dome parking lot by 3:30 p.m. Trenny and Robert Simpson hiked together all the way until they reached the summit of Andrews Bald. Once they arrived, they stopped and they ate some lunch, and then Trenny, probably cold and wet and uncomfortable, decided that she wanted to begin hiking back to the warmth of the school bus. For whatever reason, Robert decided that he wanted to stay behind and wait on the summit of the Bald for just a little bit longer. Trenny encountered a few different groups of students as she hiked back towards the parking lot. The last group that she passed had actually been taking a break on the side of the trail, and they actually invited Trenny to join them on this break, which was an offer that she declined. This resting group of students then watched Trenny stroll just a little bit further down the trail before she suddenly just stopped. This is where things start to get really bizarre in this story. Trenny apparently stopped, and then she crouched down, I guess to look at something on the right side of the trail. Then she stepped off of the trail on the right side and out of view of the resting group. This would be the last time that Trenny was ever seen dead or alive. When the resting group of students began hiking again, they walked up to the spot where Trenny had exited the trail, and they were very confused at what they saw. They expected some sort of herd path or like small trail to have branched off at that location where she hiked off, but instead there was seemingly no place to go. It was simply just a mess of shrubs, rocks, and mud with no path to follow. One of the students actually called out for Trenny, but got no response back. Another student hiked up to the group from the direction that Trenny would have traveled, and when asked if he had seen Trenny, he said no, he hadn't seen her. Unsure of what to do, the students figured that Trenny had just continued back to the parking lot, and so they left, intending to do the same thing. But when this group of students reached the bus back at Clingman's Dome, Trenny was still nowhere to be found. It didn't take long before the teacher that was overseeing the trip was made aware that Trenny had gone missing, and after this teacher and another student re-hiked the trail in order to search for her, which proved unsuccessful, they reported her missing to the National Park Service. The search for Trenny Gibson was on, and no resource was spared trying to find her. The bad weather on the day Trenny went missing made the search difficult right from the start, and things didn't get much better by the time nightfall came. Helicopters were used, large teams of searchers on foot scoured through the woods looking for any sign of the missing girl. Dogs were also utilized. At least 6 different dog teams were brought in apparently, and at one point, a few of these dogs supposedly succeeded in tracking her scent. Where her potential scent led to, though, is yet another wrench thrown into the already perplexing case. These dogs locked into her scent near the top of Clingman's Dome along the Appalachian Trail. They followed the scent past the summit tower and then led searchers part of the way down the Clingman's Dome road. When they were roughly a mile and a half from Newfound Gap, the dogs suddenly lost the scent, which possibly suggested that Trenny had been picked up by a vehicle at this location. They also apparently found some discarded cigarette butts and beers in that same spot. The search continued for 4 days, but after this, it was scaled back, largely due to lack of evidence. Searchers went out again the following spring, but they still found nothing related to Trenny Gibson's disappearance. To this day, she has never resurfaced, and her body has never been recovered. And so, what could have possibly happened to her? To be honest, I should probably just do an entire video dedicated to this story because there's a number of different theories floating around about what happened. Leave a comment if you'd be interested in me making that video, but for now, I'll briefly touch upon a few different theories and potential clues. An abduction seems plausible here, especially given that the search dogs lost her scent along the road, but I do want to point out that they tracked her scent through a very heavily trafficked area. I went up to Clingman's Dome myself, once again on my 2018 Appalachian Trail thru hike, and as you can see from this video here, I was also up there on a bad weather day, just like it was on the day that the group was there, and yet despite that, I can personally attest to the fact that there were still plenty of people around. Nobody reported seeing Trenny Gibson near the Clingman's Dome Tower or on the road where the dogs lost her scent. And again, because this area is so popular, I really have no idea how this could have happened. There's a number of other theories out there too, a lot of them foul play theories, the details of which I'll save for that future video, but I do want to note that some people have speculated that Trenny's friend, Robert Simpson, might have had something to do with her disappearance. Apparently, Robert was found with Trenny's hair comb after she disappeared, and apparently this raised some alarm bells because Trenny never went anywhere without her comb. However, Robert Simpson was never charged with anything, and I don't know, this just seems like a theory. There's not really any strong evidence. Once again, let me know if you guys want me to make that follow-up video further exploring these potential theories about what happened. And in the meantime, please keep Trenny Gibson, her friends, and her family in your hearts. Since 2 of the stories I covered today took place in the Smoky Mountains, my search and rescue call out for this video is going to be Team Busar, which is a non-profit and all-hazard search and rescue team supporting and assisting search and rescue operations in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I've made a donation to them, and though I'm not affiliated with them at all and they don't know I'm making this video, I'd encourage you to do the same. I've got a link to their website in the description. On a Sunday afternoon in January of 1980, a park ranger decided to go for a short hike. His name was Paul Fugate, and he wasn't planning on being out in the backcountry for long. And while nobody knows exactly what his objective was, we do know this. Paul Fugate never returned from his hike, and he was never seen again, dead or alive. He had gone missing in Arizona's Chiricahua National Monument, and the search for him started out small. A few fellow rangers hunted around the area's canyons by flashlight, desperately yelling Fugate's name. but they didn't find him. And so by the morning, the sheriff's office was involved. And by the next day, the National Guard was out searching for Fugate. How the hell did a park ranger of all people vanish on what was supposed to be just a short and simple hike? This was obviously the first question on everyone's mind, but as the search and investigation grew in intensity, more and more questions began to emerge. What started out as nothing more than just a short hike would eventually turn into a mystery involving multiple different theories of foul play, numerous lawsuits, an affair with a pregnancy, and much, much more. And as if that all wasn't strange enough, here we are, over 40 years later, and no closer to the truth than we were that fateful afternoon when Paul Fugate hiked out into the Arizona wilderness. This is the story of the only National Park Service ranger who vanished and has never been found. I hope you'll excuse my language here, but I just gotta say, this entire story is a giant clusterfuck. And you'll know what I mean by that by the end of this video. To start off, let's take a trip together to the mysterious Chiricahua National Monument in Arizona. Now, don't worry, this trip is free, but you must hit the subscribe button to cover admission, especially if you're a repeat viewer. You're also going to be helping us get to our goal of eventually reaching 1 million subscribers. But anyways, Chiricahua National Monument is a unit of the National Park System located in southeastern Arizona. It's most known for its volcanic rock pinnacles, and it has an 8-mile paved scenic drive, 17 miles of remote hiking trails, and a visitor center. In January of 1980, Park Ranger Paul Fugate was working out of this very visitor center, answering questions, putting together hiking trail guides, and curating park information for the visitors. Though he might fit in better today, Paul Fugate was not a typical park ranger for the 1970s and 80s. He grew his hair, mustache, and beard out, and he had what was described by some as a laid-back personality. Others described him as being lazy and as having a negative personal attitude. And by others, I actually mean the National Park Service, who in 1971 used this as well as personal grooming violations as justification for firing Paul Fugate. My understanding is that at the time, Paul had been employed by the National Park Service for about 6 years and had been stationed at 3 different parks. The first was Carlsbad Caverns National Park in New Mexico, and the second was Navajo National Monument in Arizona. And it's actually here that Paul Fugate began butting heads with his superiors. In 1967, Navajo National Monument Superintendent wrote Paul a letter which read, quote, "If you want to look and live like a hippie, that is certainly your prerogative, but not here at Navajo National Monument." It's reported that the superintendent tried to get Paul fired, but was unsuccessful for some reason. The superintendent did still manage to get Paul out of his park, however, because in 1970, the National Park Service actually transferred him to Chiricahua National Monument. Approximately 1 year after that, Paul's position was officially terminated. However, Paul did not go down without a fight. Upon his termination, Paul Fugate hired a civil rights lawyer, and for the next 5 years, he fought back in court trying to get his job back. Now, I don't know the details of the legal battle, but I do know that ultimately, Paul Fugate was successful, and by 1976, he was once again working as a park ranger at Chiricahua National Monument. The National Park Service even had to provide him with some back pay due to his 5-year absence. In the years that followed, Paul Fugate would spend his time hanging out with the younger seasonal employees at Chiricahua. He would spend his time making trips to Tucson to visit his wife, and he would spend time working on his vehicle. He was described as a lost soul by one of his fellow rangers, who also said, quote, "Paul wasn't going to go anywhere in the Park Service. They had it out for him." Though the legal conflicts had since been settled, it appeared that Paul's presence within the National Park Service was certainly not being celebrated. And then, on January 13th, 1980, Paul Fugate went for a hike. He had been working at the park's visitor center, and around 2 p.m., he set out, apparently hiking towards Faraway Ranch. There was one other coworker at the visitor center when Paul left. Paul actually told her that if he wasn't back by 4:30 p.m., then she should just shut down the visitor center without him. He was wearing his Park Service uniform with his badge, but he left his radio, his ID, and other personal items behind, which indicates that he wasn't planning on being gone for very long. After Paul left the visitor center, he was never seen again. At 8 p.m., his coworker reported him missing, and a few other rangers began searching the park by flashlight, calling out his name along the way. When this initial search was unsuccessful, the sheriff's office was called in, and by the next morning, 22 people were conducting a ground search, and they even brought along a search dog. But this search, too, proved unsuccessful, and so the next day, the National Guard was brought in to search the park on the ground and by air. At one point, searchers actually found some footprints, which gave them some hope, but this hope was quickly dashed when they realized the footprints had actually been created by another searcher. The official search for Paul Fugate lasted just over 2 weeks, but an unofficial search headed up by Paul's wife lasted for years to come. And despite all this searching, exactly 0 physical evidence was found, let alone Paul himself or his body. While the investigation into Paul Fugate's disappearance entered year number 2, controversy was brewing on the side. This came in the form of a lawsuit between Paul's wife and the National Park Service. Shortly after Paul disappeared, the Park Service declared him missing and therefore began making partial salary payments to his wife. These payments ended up totaling just under $7,000 at the time, which is worth roughly $25,000 today. But roughly a year later, in early 1981, the director of the Park Service's Western region reviewed Paul Fugate's case and made the determination that Paul had, quote, voluntarily abandoned his position. This led to him officially being fired, and the Park Service even demanded that his wife repay the money that she had been given, plus 11% interest. Paul's wife was told that no appeal would be possible, and so she lawyered up, and eventually, by the end of the 1980s, got the government to finally pay her Paul's retirement benefits and approximately $40,000 in back pay, which is worth almost $100,000 in today's money. Now, some people think this was a massive injustice on the part of the Park Service, and maybe it was. Other people believe that Paul's wife may have actually been involved in her husband's disappearance. That's right, it's time to get into the main theories into what happened to Paul Fugate, and I just want to stress that I'm not aware of any hard evidence that proves any of these theories. I want to make that crystal clear. These are all speculation. Take it with a huge grain of salt, but with that said, here are the 2 main theories about what happened to Paul Fugate, plus a bonus third theory that I don't think is being talked about anywhere, but I just couldn't shake it from my mind. The first theory is that Paul simply ran away and wanted to start a new life somewhere. Now, this is always a theory tossed around when somebody goes missing, and my understanding is that one of the main things driving this theory, Paul Fugate was having an affair with a Park Service coworker who had actually gotten pregnant with his child. And apparently this coworker had told Paul about the pregnancy only a few days before he went missing. Apparently, Paul's wife knew about the affair and was kind of okay with it, actually. And so maybe calling it an affair isn't even true. Paul was apparently still very dedicated to his wife and had no intentions of leaving her. I don't know, maybe it was more of like an open marriage kind of thing. But either way, investigator Pat Hanley believes that Paul was frustrated from his conflicts within the Park Service. He was having issues in his marriage and had now accidentally gotten his much younger girlfriend pregnant. And so he just decided to run away one day. I even read a few articles stating that there was actually an unconfirmed sighting of Paul Fugate in Bend, Oregon in 1983, so that would potentially support this theory. Although I will say that I could hardly find any detailed information about this sighting. To me, it kind of seems like the sighting was either just a false sighting or that it never even happened. Regardless, this theory certainly does seem plausible, and it's one that multiple people involved in the investigation believe to be true. And I'll remind you once again that the entire reason Paul's wife was ordered to pay back the National Park Service in 1981 was because at the time, the Park Service believed that her husband had just run off. But if that's what Paul Fugate did, then what explanation is there for the valuable things that he left behind? A gun collection, expensive camera equipment, over $1,000 worth of cash in today's money, and his Chevy truck that he was in the process of restoring. Now, obviously, this doesn't completely discredit the runaway theory, but it does make you wonder. Now, the second theory about what happened to Paul Fugate is that he was murdered. After the disappearance, a Park Service volunteer who was actually friends with Paul came forward with a potential clue. This volunteer said that on the day Paul went missing, he drove by a pickup truck and actually saw Paul inside, slumped between two men as the truck sped away at like 50 miles per hour. Other employees at Chiricahua National Monument allegedly saw vehicle tracks and signs of a struggle in the dirt near Faraway Ranch, the intended destination of Paul's hike. Now, this sighting and evidence has never been proven to be true, and I'm not even sure which murder theory it supports, honestly. The first of these murder theories is that Paul was actually met with foul play due to accidentally stumbling upon illegal drug activity. Due to the park's close proximity to the Mexican border, it wasn't exactly unheard of for drug traffickers to be in the area at the time. That holds true for well beyond the 1980s. In fact, in 2013, a Park Service employee was nearly killed by an alleged drug smuggler at Faraway Ranch, which is undeniable proof that the possibility of violence exists in the area. There were a few different suspects over the course of the investigation, and in 1983, a detective from the sheriff's office actually announced that he would be charging, quote, persons with the homicide of Paul Fugate in the not-so-distant future. However, no one was ever arrested, which is really bizarre that the government would just come out, make this announcement, and then nobody gets arrested. I don't know. According to a 1981 article from the New York Times, Paul Fugate's wife and her legal team believed that Paul was hiking alone when he accidentally stumbled upon a drug deal. And since he was in uniform and wearing his badge, the drug traffickers responded with violence and abducted him. There are some people out there that don't believe this theory and actually instead point the finger at Paul's wife herself. I am not accusing Paul's wife of murder. In fact, I'm not aware of any solid, real evidence that points the finger at her. My understanding is that it's all just vague speculation. There are some people out there who believe that Paul's wife's actions following Paul's disappearance were somewhat suspicious. Paul's wife didn't arrive at Chiricahua National Monument until 4 days after her husband had vanished, which is, it's pretty odd, you gotta admit, because she only lived a few hours away. And since she wasn't a suspect at the time and still really has never been a suspect, her home was never searched and she was never asked by the authorities to provide an alibi. According to one Park Service employee, Paul's wife seemed more upset about her husband getting his coworker pregnant than she was about him disappearing. And all of that weird stuff aside, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the potential financial motive that Paul's wife might have had. When investigators searched Paul's cabin, they found an unfinished life insurance application, and then 2 weeks after Paul's disappearance, his wife was already asking Paul's boss about when she would receive her husband's retirement benefits. That's really weird because at this point, it had only been 2 weeks. Obviously, none of the things I just said could even be considered close to proof of murder. And while Paul's wife was never really considered a true suspect, she did actually take a polygraph test, and during it, she was asked if she had anything to do with her husband's disappearance. I just want to be clear, I'm well aware that polygraph tests are not reliable. You can't even use them as evidence in court. So make of that what you will, but Paul's wife was never charged, let alone convicted of murdering her husband. And so allow me to suggest a third theory about who could have potentially killed Paul Fugate. And this is a theory, by the way, that I've seen very little speculation or conversation about. Now, I try not to inject my opinion too much in these videos, but when I do, I try to make it clear that I'm doing that. And so make no mistake, I'm going to share my opinion with this next point. I'm just wondering if it's possible that maybe the National Park Service itself had something to do with Paul Fugate's disappearance. There's no true evidence of this, so I'm probably way off, but I don't know. While researching for this video, I just couldn't get this theory out of my mind. I mean, once again, Paul Fugate had numerous conflicts with the National Park Service. He was officially fired twice. He had conflicts with his supervisors. He spent 5 years battling the National Park Service in court, and then he went and got one of his fellow employees pregnant. And then a year after his disappearance, the National Park Service quite confidently declared that he had abandoned his job and ran away, despite not really having any evidence of this. I don't know. Again, this is far from proof of anything. I really don't know, but I don't know. It just makes me a little suspicious, and I haven't really heard anyone talking about this. Is it possible that maybe the Park Service was just sick of him and wanted him gone once and for all? I don't know. Maybe one of these theories is true, or maybe none of them are, and Paul simply went for a hike, got lost, and succumbed to the elements. That's certainly possible as well. The truth is that we don't know what happened, but hopefully we will someday. And the reason that I say that is because the investigation into Paul Fugate's disappearance is still active. And a few years ago, the Park Service actually raised the reward to $60,000 for information leading to his whereabouts or the arrest and conviction of whoever is responsible for his disappearance. Today, I'm going to be telling you 3 different stories about people who set off into the wilderness to go for a simple hike, but then were never seen again, dead or alive. All 3 of these hikers disappeared in U.S. national parks, and to this day, none of their cases have ever been solved. Taking place from the depths of the Grand Canyon all the way to the alpine lakes of Yosemite, I want as many people as possible to hear these stories, and that's for 2 reasons. Number 1 is so that future hikers can learn from these stories and stay out of danger, and number 2 is so that the missing hikers have a greater chance of someday being found. So to start off, I invite you on a virtual trip to one of the most beautiful and also dangerous places in all of America, the Grand Canyon. Now, this trip is free, but you must hit the subscribe button right now to cover admission, especially if you're a repeat viewer and you haven't subscribed yet. All right, let's go to the Grand Canyon. On Friday, June 17th, 2016, Floyd Roberts III, his friend Ned Bryant, and Bryant's daughter set out for a 9-day backpacking trip in the Grand Canyon. Roberts and Bryant were longtime hiking partners. In 1992, they actually took their first trip together to Grand Canyon National Park, and they would end up coming back several times over the next 24 years. The 2 men had met each other at age 10 living in New Jersey, and eventually Roberts went on to live in Huntsville, Alabama, where he worked for a while for NASA, of all places. And at the time of the hike in question, he was living in Florida teaching computer programming and game design at a middle school. So, I mean, he worked for NASA, he's teaching programming. Clearly, Roberts was a smart man, and he was also a fairly experienced backpacker, again, clearly due to all the experience he had in the Grand Canyon. And these two things make the circumstances that surround his disappearance all the more bizarre, as you're about to find out. On day one of their backpacking trip, the group hiked out into extreme heat conditions. Roberts was wearing a red long-sleeved shirt, blue denim jeans, Nike free sneakers, and a large blue backpack. Not exactly ideal clothing, especially the jeans, to wear during a heat wave while doing strenuous exercise, I will say. Around 4:45 in the afternoon, the group made a decision that probably seemed quite routine at the time, but would soon prove to be an absolute disaster. There was a small hill standing in the group's way, one that was estimated to only take about 30 minutes to climb over. For reasons that are unknown to me, the group decided to split up. Brian and his daughter wanted to climb over the hill, and Roberts wanted to go around it. And so that's what they did. The Bryants made steady progress up the hill, and they expected to see Roberts waiting for them on the other side because they had taken the harder route after all. But much to their confusion and later dismay, when they got over and down the other side of the hill, Roberts wasn't there. The Bryants waited for him and waited for him, but eventually they got anxious and they began searching. Roberts still hadn't showed up. They searched and found nothing, and eventually decided to actually double back towards where the group had made the split, and eventually they just had to make camp. They even went as far as displaying their colorful sleeping bags out in the open around their campsite, hoping that Roberts would spot them. But by morning, Roberts still hadn't showed up, and the Bryants knew at this point the only thing that they could do was to report him missing. They found some cell service, and they did just that. And soon after, the National Park Service launched an extensive search using helicopters, dogs, and ground search teams. It was a massive effort, but despite that, Roberts was not found. Floyd Roberts was last seen near Kelly Tanks, heading towards Trail Canyon or 214 Mile Canyon in the Shanley Springs area, though it's possible he instead descended into the 209 Mile Canyon. He was last seen carrying 2 gallons of water, a week's worth of food, and a map of the hiking group's planned route. No trace of Roberts, his gear, or anything related to his disappearance has ever been found. There's no solid leads into what happened. Perhaps he just succumbed to the elements. I mean, it does seem plausible given the extreme heat, but honestly, the truth is, we don't really know what happened. But regardless of the circumstances in this case, I do want you all to understand that you should never, ever underestimate the dangers of heat stroke while you're hiking. And with that said, for our next story, let's head to Yosemite National Park. On June 15th, 2005, Michael Fissery was on a solo backpacking trip in Yosemite National Park when something went horribly wrong. Unfortunately, we don't know what. The 51-year-old California native was described as, quote, an off-the-grid kind of guy, and he was very outdoorsy. It was reported that Fissery would actually cycle to his job at the post office every day, and that he was a very experienced hiker and backpacker. One of the places that Fissery had frequented on his numerous backpacking trips was Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. Though remote and rugged, he knew the area very well. And that makes the events that transpired in June of 2005 even more bizarre than they would have otherwise been. The details are a little bit confusing to me, to be honest, but I'm pretty sure Fissery's plan was to start at the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir and then do some sort of loop near Till Mountain, around towards Lake Vernon, and then back to the reservoir, back to his car. It's unclear to me if his original plan had him traveling up the Till Valley or not, but that's evidently where he ended up, perhaps temporarily, or perhaps permanently. The last known sighting of Fishery placed him at Hetch Hetchy. He then began hiking north towards Till Mountain on a trail that eventually intersects with the Pacific Crest Trail, but after he left the reservoir, he was never seen again. Though Hetch Hetchy is a fairly popular area, once hikers leave the reservoir, which has a road to it, they're going straight into an extremely remote and inaccessible area. On June 21st, Fishery's family alerted the Park Service that he had not returned home. His backcountry permit had expired, and he was supposed to have been home by then, so his family knew that something must have gone wrong. Fishery's car was found in the parking lot for the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, but there was no sign of him there other than that. Though Fishery's family was certainly scared, they had not given up hope yet that he would be found alive, and that's because, incredibly, on a previous solo backpacking trip in Yellowstone National Park, Fishery had actually broken his ankle and ended up crawling back to civilization, making a successful self-rescue effort. Absolutely incredible. And because of this, I imagine his family was probably holding out hope, thinking that if he had been able to survive that previous time, he certainly had what it takes to survive this time as well. Officials searched all around the reservoir and all of the trails in the surrounding area, even all the way up to the Pacific Crest Trail, but initially, they found no sign of Fishery. However, this would soon change when they discovered a very important clue near Till Mountain. Officials discovered Michael Fishery's backpack, his water bottle, his camera, and a topographical map, and they found it just off the trail near the snow line on the east side of the mountain. I'm sure this discovery brought a lot of hope to the searchers and certainly to Fishery's family, but this hope would soon be gone as the search dragged on and no additional clues, let alone Fishery himself, were discovered. Eventually, the discovery of the backpack and the other gear would not bring hope, but it would actually crush it, as Fishery's friends insisted that he would never have left his backpack somewhere behind and just hiked off somewhere else. To this day, nobody knows what happened to Michael Fishery or why his backpack and some of his gear was left abandoned. As a hiker myself, I will say that it's not unheard of for people to drop their packs temporarily while taking a side trail up to a peak, and then they come back and gather their stuff. So I don't know, it's possible that Fishery did this and then had some sort of accident while he was away from his gear. I don't really know. There were massive searches for Michael Fishery, so it's not like he hasn't been found due to lack of effort. Searchers were called in from 5 different counties, multiple aircraft was used, cadaver dogs were used, and they failed to pick up any scents, and the Marines were even enlisted to help with the search. The Park Service reportedly spent almost $500,000 looking for Michael Fishery, and yet they still came up empty-handed. The hard truth is that we don't know and may never know the full story of his last hike. It's almost as though the mountains simply swallowed him whole. He wasn't the first, and he definitely wasn't the last, because 14 years later, the mountains would swallow another hiker whole, this time in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. For most visitors to Rocky Mountain National Park, summer is the ideal season. This makes total sense, right? The weather is much milder, which makes it easier to enjoy some of the best scenery that Colorado has to offer. For some folks, however, winter is actually the more ideal time to visit, and the harshness of the cold and the snow just adds to the charm. Presumably, this is how 70-year-old James Pruitt felt. Pruitt was on his 3rd annual visit to Rocky Mountain National Park, and so far, all 3 visits had been during the winter months. Pruitt was from Tennessee, and so it makes sense that he in particular might enjoy the winter scenery more than others, because it was just much different than what he was used to in the South. Now, Pruitt was not keeping his family in the loop on his specific plans, but they did know that he arrived in the area on February 22nd, 2019. It's unclear to me what he spent the first few days of his trip doing, but one thing is crystal clear. On Thursday, February 28th, Pruitt set out on a hike, and then he was never seen again. Since his family wasn't keeping close tabs on him, a few days actually went by before anyone realized that Pruitt was missing. Then, on March 3rd, patrolling rangers noticed that a car had been parked overnight at the Glacier Gorge trailhead located in the central part of the park. Now, this is a national park after all, so it's perfectly normal for hikers to leave their cars overnight. But the park rangers grew suspicious and also worried because they realized there was no backcountry permit associated with this particular car. This suggested that whoever parked the car there either did it illegally or, more likely, didn't intend to spend the night outside. They ran the car's plates and they realized that it belonged to James Pruitt. The Park Service started their investigation by contacting Pruitt's family, and this is how they learned that the last time anyone had heard from him was on the morning of February 28th around 10 a.m. They also learned that Pruitt was only planning a day hike and was not planning to stay overnight in the backcountry. And this lined up with the fact that he never received a backcountry permit from the Park Service. Investigators were soon able to place him at the Safeway in Estes Park, Colorado. I think that's how you say that. At 9:28 a.m. when an image of him leaving the store was captured by the security camera. This, unfortunately, would prove to be James Pruitt's last photo. After leaving Safeway, it's assumed that Pruitt entered the national park, drove to Glacier Gorge, and then vanished somewhere out in the backcountry. Nobody knows what his intended destination was on his day hike, which left searchers a lot of ground to cover. And to make matters worse, storms had dropped more than 2 feet of snow in the area between the time that Pruitt went missing and the time that the search was started. Active searching took place from the day Pruitt's car was found, March 3rd, all the way through March 9th. A search perimeter was set up which encompassed approximately 15 square miles of terrain, and searchers were concentrated near the Glacier Gorge trailhead, Chaos Creek, Mills Lake, among a few other potential destinations that Pruitt could have been trying to hike to. The searchers were reportedly trudging through chest-deep snow when they went off trail, and it was just a grueling, really difficult search. And it was also a large effort. Dogs were used, aircraft was used, and they searched tirelessly for nearly a week. Eventually, though, the search was scaled back, though limited search efforts continued through the summer and fall of 2019, but no clues were ever found about what happened to James Pruitt. Absolutely nothing. No body, no gear, not even any tracks. Now, Pruitt may have been wearing a blue jacket, a red or orange hat, and microspikes on his boots when he went missing. His story is certainly concerning, but in my opinion, it kind of makes sense how someone could go missing while solo hiking in the winter. Pruitt's disappearance, it just doesn't really strike me as super suspicious, though it is sad. This next disappearance, however, is definitely suspicious in my opinion. I would even say it's probably one of the most suspicious disappearances in national park history. Now you might be thinking, I thought there was only going to be 3 stories in this video. That's right, I only promised you 3, but I'm actually going to throw in a bonus 4th as an enticement to please hit the subscribe button. On July 25th, 1981, a group from Saratoga, California headed up to Yosemite National Park for a horse riding and hiking trip. The group consisted of 14-year-old Stacy Arez, her father George, an older man named Gerald Stewart, and several others. And by the way, I'm not exactly sure of the way to pronounce it. I don't know if it's Arez, I'm sorry. The location of their trip was the Sunrise Meadows area of Yosemite National Park, which, just for the record, is not that far away from Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, where Michael Fissery went missing. The group rode in on their horses for a few hours, and eventually they arrived at Sunrise High Sierra Camp, which was where they were planning on spending the night. There were some limited accommodations at this camp, including cabins and some showers, which the group quickly took advantage of after they arrived. After showering, Stacy told her father that she wanted to go for a short hike around the area in order to photograph the scenery and stretch her legs. She invited her dad to tag along, but for some reason he declined. He did, however, suggest to her that she should change out of her flip-flops and put on her hiking boots, which were obviously much more suited for the terrain. Unfortunately, This would end up being the last conversation that George Erez would ever have with his daughter. Now, instead of her dad coming along, Stacy actually found another hiking companion in 77-year-old Gerald Stewart, who had ridden in with the group that day. It's unclear to me exactly where the two were planning on hiking, but either way, it wasn't supposed to be very far. There was a flooded meadow a few hundred yards away from Sunrise High Sierra Camp, and there was also a 1.5-mile long trail to Sunrise Lakes. The two set off, and it wasn't long before Stewart realized that he wasn't going to be able to keep up. He was in his late 70s after all. And so he sat down, and Stacy continued on without him. Again, they weren't planning on going very far, and it's for this reason that nobody made any attempt to stop Stacy. She quickly disappeared from Stewart's sight, though one other member of the party was back at the campsite, and apparently off in the distance, he actually had eyes on Stacy for a little bit longer than Stewart, and this person supposedly saw Stacy standing on a rock that was roughly 50 yards south of the trail, and that was the last time that she was ever seen. Eventually, Gerald Stewart, George Erez, and the rest of the group became concerned and started searching for Stacy, but they didn't find her. I did see one source that stated that while Stewart was resting, he spoke with a group of people hiking the opposite way, and this group reported that they did not see Stacy, but I'm not exactly sure if this is true. The Park Service sprung into action as soon as Stacy was reported missing. They had well over 100 people searching the backcountry, including specialized climbers who were covering the more dangerous, hard to get to parts of the terrain, and they also had multiple helicopters and cadaver dogs. The only clue that all of this searching produced was Stacy's lens cap, which was found nearby one of the lakes not far from where she was last seen. To this day, over 40 years later, no other sign of Stacy has ever been found. Now, in my opinion, this disappearance is quite suspicious, and that's because unlike some of the other ones I've covered in this video, there was no bad weather, she wasn't really hiking alone either, and she wasn't hiking very far from where her camp was. Some people will suggest that Gerald Stewart may have killed her, but keep in mind, again, this guy was 77 years old. It would have been very difficult for him to kill her and then quickly hide her body and also hide it so close to where they were camped and where they would obviously search. It's also been reported that Stacy was having some family trouble and maybe some trouble with her boyfriend back home. And so maybe she ran off intentionally, but I don't really see that as a likely possibility either, because if that was the case, why did she originally try to hike off in her flip-flops before her dad made her change her shoes? And also, speaking of her dad, why would she have invited her dad and Gerald Stewart to come with her if she was planning on running off? All of the disappearances in this video are bizarre, they're frustrating, and they're very sad. My heart goes out to the missing and their families, and also to all of the men and women who worked tirelessly to try and bring them home. Few people were more experienced in the remote backcountry of the Sierra Nevada mountains than James Randall Morganson, also known as Randy. I say this because Randy Morganson spent 27 seasons as a park ranger in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. For 27 years, he patrolled these harsh mountains, helping out hikers along the way and working to protect the environment of the pristine national parks. Now, 27 seasons is a lot, but the truth is, it should have been 28. Honestly, it should have been even more than that, because one day while on a routine patrol of the backcountry, Randy Morganson vanished. At first, his disappearance seemed likely to be an accident, because after all, the terrain that he was working in was very, very tough. But after troubling details of Randy's personal life became known, the possibility that his disappearance might have been intentional became more and more real. This is the tragic story of Randy Morganson. My goal is to get this channel to 100,000 subscribers. I have a long ways to go. Please help me get to that goal. Hit that subscribe button. I'll give you a second. Okay, thank you. Let's talk about Randy Morganson. Randy Morganson spent more than half of his life working as a backcountry ranger in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. In 1996, Randy was 54 years old and began his 28th season with the Park Service. I hiked through Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks for the first time last year in 2022, and so after witnessing this terrain firsthand, I can tell you straight up, it's crazy there. I've hiked thousands of miles in my life, and the terrain in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park is right up there at the top in terms of just the most like out of this world stuff I've ever done. You're surrounded by rugged mountains as tall as 14,000 feet above sea level. There's tons of freezing cold alpine lakes, and there's also an endless amount of fast flowing rivers. The fact that Randy Morganson had so many years of experience in such a harsh environment puts him at an elite level of backcountry skill. And it should be no surprise to hear that with all that experience, he was the most senior ranger that was patrolling in the High Sierra. In 1996, Randy Morganson was working at the Bench Lake Ranger Station, which is just off of the John Muir Trail / Pacific Crest Trail. On July 20th, he reported his position via park radio as being at Mather Pass on the PCT. The next day, on July 21st, he departed from the Bench Lake Ranger Station and left a note saying that he was going to be going on patrol for just a few days. At some point during this day, a few hikers allegedly spoke with Randy somewhere along the John Muir / Pacific Crest Trail, and they reported that during this interaction, Randy was in good spirits. But in very tragic fashion, this would be the last contact that anybody ever had with Randy Morganson. And his radio contact from the previous day would be the last time that the Park Service ever heard from him. It wouldn't be long before a desperate search for him began and questions about his personal life began being raised. While spending time in nature is certainly a positive for a lot of people's mental health, it's not a cure-all, and unfortunately, Randy's case proves this. Going into the 1996 season, it's been reported that Randy Morganson was suffering from depression. He even had a conversation with another park ranger in which he basically questioned the one thing that he had dedicated his entire adult life to, which was his service as a park ranger. That was definitely not a good sign because, once again, he had dedicated his life to this. He was the most senior ranger in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. And while the reasons for his depression aren't explicitly clear, it does seem likely that it had something to do with his strained relationship with his wife, Judy. I can definitely see how challenging it must be to have a successful marriage when one of the spouses is spending months and months away working in the remote backcountry. I'm assuming here, but I think it's a fair assumption to imagine that this might have had an impact on Randy and his wife's marriage. I did find one report that said his wife had frequently joined him in the mountains, but in the years before his disappearance, she had stopped doing this. I'm not sure how true this is, but either way, it's clear that things were not okay in Randy and Judy's marriage. And to make matters even worse, it's been reported that Randy had recently had an affair with another ranger. And at the start of the 1996 season, Randy had received divorce papers from his wife. Randy Morganson had reportedly told close friend and fellow ranger George Durkee that he had occasionally felt like ending his own life. In fact, the day before Randy went missing, he had had some radio contact with Durkee and Durkee's wife, and the couple reported that it was a little bit weird, like Randy was asking them some questions that he didn't really need the answers to, and it kind of just seemed like he was asking the questions over the radio because he wanted somebody to talk to. And it got even stranger because at the end of the radio conversation, Randy was quoted as saying, "I won't be bothering you two anymore." Because of this depressed state that Randy was known to have been in, after he went missing, there was a lot of speculation about whether or not it had been an accident and he was still out there somewhere, or if he had intentionally wandered off to potentially take his own life. There was even some other theories as well, such as the suggestion that maybe Randy had been met with foul play. Investigators feared that this might have been a possibility when they learned that on 2 separate occasions, Randy had been threatened threatened with violence from individuals within the park. However, they determined that both of these suspects had alibis, and therefore the foul play theory was eliminated pretty quickly. There was also the theory that perhaps Randy Morganson had just simply fled the park in order to start a new life somewhere. At first, this seemed plausible. However, Randy's car was found parked in its usual spot for when he was going on patrol, and in addition to that, there was never any withdrawals from his bank accounts, and his credit cards were never used either. Thus, it seemed like the only two remaining possibilities were that Randy either got lost or he intentionally took his life. And in order to find out which one of these scenarios was true, they needed to search. Randy Morganson was reported missing on July 24th, 1996, and shortly afterwards, the search for him was on. District Ranger Randy Kaufman was in charge of the search, and since many of the searchers were also Randy Morganson's colleagues and friends, he found himself in a unique position. Kaufman wanted to take advantage of the fact that the searchers for Randy were also people that had a personal relationship with him as colleagues. And in order to do this, he conducted a secret ballot with all of the rangers. The searchers agreed on a zone that was roughly 80 square miles, which represented the limits of where Randy Morganson could have traveled on a 4-day patrol. Kaufman then divided this zone into 16 segments and assigned each segment a letter A through P. Kaufman then interviewed each ranger individually and had them assign a number value to each segment based on the likelihood that they thought Randy was there. And the rangers were also required to assign a number value to a rest of world option, which represented how likely they thought it was that Randy was not inside of the 80 square mile zone. After the secret ballot was completed, the areas with the highest scores were Lake Basin, as seen right here, and Marion Lake, meaning these were the areas that the rangers collectively believed that Randy had most likely gone to. These were fairly predictable results because Randy had not yet patrolled in either one of those areas in 1996, meaning that they would be good areas for Randy to hit on his next patrol. The rest of world option was voted as the least likely option, indicating that most rangers believed that Randy was still inside the park and still inside that 80 square mile zone. However, there was one ranger that gave the rest of world option an alarmingly high score, and this was Ranger George Durkee, who just a few minutes ago I mentioned was one of Randy's close friends. Durkee knew about a lot of the turmoil that was going on in Randy's marriage and his personal life. And because of this, he believed that Randy might have run off somewhere outside of the park to either start a new life or hopefully not, but still possibly end his life. With all of this input from the rangers, a massive search was conducted. By July 30th, 94 people were on the ground searching, 5 helicopters were scoping out the area from the sky, and 8 dog teams were attempting to pick up scents. A few random pieces of gear were found, but none of it was able to be traced to Randy. Search dogs were able to follow a few scents, but all of them ended abruptly. And they even spotted a suspicious campfire from a helicopter, but they couldn't find anybody that was tending to it. By August 3rd, 1996, the active search for Randy Morganson was called off with no trace of a body and no evidence. Nothing whatsoever. For the next 5 years, nobody knew what happened to Randy. His missing person flyer remained up at trailheads around the national parks, and individual rangers continued to search for him while they were on their patrols. However, in July of 2001, everything in Randy's case changed. On Sunday, July 15th, 2001, a group of off-duty trail crew members were bushwhacking in the area near Window Peak. This part of the national park has no trail access, and so it's rarely visited and extremely remote. While the group was making its way up a stream northeast of the aforementioned Window Peak, a discarded backpack caught their eye. This would have been very unusual to see in an area that gets so little foot traffic and is so remote. The backpack was found just below some pools of a waterfall, and upon closer investigation, the group discovered a few more items. And one of these items would go on to haunt them because it was a hiking boot, and sticking out of it
was a human leg bone. Investigators flew into the area the day after the discovery was made, and it wasn't long before they were able to conclude that the remains found were in fact Randy Morganson's. They knew this because the gear found matched what Randy had been known to be carrying shortly before his disappearance, and they also found his National Park Service name tag. Dental records were later able to confirm that it was in fact Randy Morganson's remains. So now that Randy had finally been discovered, the question is, what could have possibly happened to him? A few times earlier in the video, I laid out the two most likely scenarios. The first being it was an accident and he died as a result of that, or he intentionally took his own life. You'd think that the discovery of his remains would clearly point to one of these circumstances being the truth. But unfortunately, this discovery didn't really give a super clear answer. Let's break down the evidence for each scenario, and let's start by assuming that Randy's death was in fact an accident. First of all, if Randy wanted to end his own life, it's pretty reasonable to assume that he would have done it with a firearm. And the reason this is a fair assumption is because Randy had one. He was a park ranger. Park rangers have full law enforcement capabilities, and therefore they are armed when they are out patrolling. However, when they searched Randy's Bench Lake Ranger Station, his firearm was found there, locked up and tucked away. He did not take it with him when he went on patrol. The location that Randy's body was found in also makes the accident scenario very plausible. He was found at the bottom of a waterfall, and investigators believe he probably was crossing the stream on a snow bridge, took a step and fell through, breaking his leg. Unable to walk and unable to call for help with his radio because of bad signal, Randy would have eventually died from exposure or perhaps been swept over the waterfall. Once again, the terrain in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks is extremely rugged. It's very unforgiving, and therefore I think it's entirely possible that even a really experienced ranger like Randy Morganson could still have a fatal accident out there. Personally, I think that the accident scenario is the most likely thing that happened. However, there is also some circumstantial evidence that suggests that Randy may have gone out there and taken his own life. First of all, one of the very few benefits that park rangers received back in 1996 was a $100,000 payout to their families if they died in the line of duty. If a ranger were to take their own life, this payout would not be made. Therefore, it's possible that Randy may have ended his own life and then disguised it as an accident so that his wife would receive that $100,000 payout. Now, this scenario is pretty far-fetched, I think. I think it would just be pretty difficult to disguise taking your own life like this. But then again, 5 years went by from the time that he disappeared and the time that he was discovered. And so my understanding is that the condition that Randy was found in wasn't really able to indicate exactly what happened. There's also another really weird circumstance that maybe points to Randy taking his own life, or at the very least something bizarre going on. Investigators discovered Randy's park-issued radio at the top of the waterfall, not at the bottom where his remains and the rest of his stuff was found. And the radio was switched to the on position, which suggests that at the time it was last used, Randy may have been using it in an effort to monitor conversations and perhaps elude the search parties. Ranger Bob Keenan, who helped search for Randy, found this very suspicious. He recalled searching the exact gorge where Randy Morganson was found, and even recalled crossing the stream at the exact spot where Randy's radio was found. He specifically remembered that spot because he had used it on multiple occasions in the past to cross that creek, and he insists that if the radio was there when he was searching, he would have seen it. This suggests that maybe Randy had been somewhere else when the area was searched, and he had come back at a later time while monitoring his radio. The National Park Service officially maintains that Randy Morganson's death was an accident. When addressing the fact that the area Randy was found in had been searched multiple times, the Park Service was quoted saying, "It's likely that his body was not seen due to the high amount of runoff in the stream that summer." And this very well may be the case. Like I said earlier, I think this probably is what happened. However, it's been 22 years since his remains were discovered, and we still don't really have any conclusive answers as to what happened to Randy Morganson. May he rest in peace, and my heart goes out to his wife and the rest of his friends and family.
Though you might not have ever thought about this, The job of being a park ranger can be, pardon my language here, but dangerous as f. This job involves so much more than just like standing at a visitor center and directing tourists to where the bathrooms are. Park rangers are law enforcement officers, which means that they have to deal with many of the same risks that normal police officers do. But in addition to that, they must also patrol the remote backcountry and all of its hazards. And they also have to be the first ones to confront dangerous animals that are putting the park's visitors at risk. And so because of all this, it's no surprise that on many occasions, park rangers have died, been murdered, or just straight up disappeared in the line of duty. For today's video, I've picked out 3 stories of park rangers who died while doing their jobs, but I'm gonna be doing more than just telling you their stories and then moving on. I have some questions about each of these stories, questions that even years after the story took place remain unanswered. So I'll be highlighting these unanswered questions as I go along in this video, and I also want to hear your potential theories, answers to these questions, or your other unanswered questions in the comment section as well, respectfully, of course. So with that said, please join me on a trip to one of the most beautiful places in all of the United States. That would be the great state of Colorado. I want to go back. This trip is free, it costs you nothing, but you gotta hit the subscribe button to cover your admission, especially if you're a repeat viewer and you haven't yet subscribed. Okay, so let's go to Rocky Mountain National Park. Around 11 a.m. on July 29th, 2005, a coworker dropped Ranger Jeff Christensen off at the Chapin Pass trailhead, where he was gonna start a days-long backcountry patrol of the Mummy Range. About 2 hours after he was dropped off, he briefly encountered a couple from Oklahoma. They were hiking along, and they described Ranger Christensen as, quote, chipper, and they also said that he was moving well through the difficult terrain. But unfortunately, after Ranger Christensen parted ways with these hikers, he was never seen alive ever again. He was hiking solo, and these solo backcountry patrols are very common for rangers. I mean, it's just part of their job. But as a safety precaution, rangers do carry radios with them. Now, the area that Ranger Christensen was patrolling that day was definitely remote, and as I've established, it was rugged and difficult, but it was known to have radio coverage. Later on in the evening, Ranger Christensen failed to check in on his radio, and then the next morning, he didn't arrive for his scheduled shift. His fellow rangers in Rocky Mountain National Park knew that something was wrong, and so they launched a search. They did not half-ass this search either. Over 200 people began combing the backcountry, searching along Ranger Christensen's planned route for that day. They even brought in dogs, I believe up to 5 of them, and they also used aircraft, helicopters, spotter planes, things like that. I mean, they went all out. This was a massive search effort, and it lasted for over a week. But unfortunately, on August 6th, a hiker would accidentally stumble across a disturbing sight that would halt the search in its tracks. So this hiker finds Ranger Jeff Christensen, and he was obviously, at this point, you could probably tell, not found alive. Ranger Christensen was found dead from an apparent fall. He was located in an area that was very high up between 2 rugged 13,000-foot mountains. And unfortunately, investigators were not able to determine why he fell or even where he fell from. Park spokeswoman Kyle Patterson was quoted saying, "Anyone who's hiked in high elevation terrain knows the things that can go wrong. It could be a loose rock. He could have lost his balance or stubbed his toe. It could have been a shoelace. We'll never know. These kinds of areas are extremely unforgiving if you fall." So they weren't able to determine exactly what happened, but they were able to determine, disturbingly, that Ranger Christensen didn't die immediately after the fall. His body was reportedly found with bandages on his head. And so investigators believe that he actually must have survived initially and then, patched himself up, walked a short distance before he finally went unconscious. So, I mean, that's tough. It's disturbing. And it also raises a few unanswered questions about what would otherwise be a pretty straightforward accident in the backcountry. My biggest question is, why didn't Ranger Christensen use his radio to call for help after his fall? Now, if he was knocked unconscious or died immediately, then that would obviously explain things here. But again, he was aware enough to like put some bandages on his head and to like attempt to rescue himself. It seems to me that if he was capable of doing those things, then he would have also been capable of using his radio to try to contact somebody. Now, it is reported that rescuers heard a few like radio clicks around the time that it's estimated Ranger Christensen was injured, but there's obviously no way to confirm where those clicks came from. And another potential answer is that by the time Ranger Christensen was found, his radio battery was completely dead. So it's definitely possible that something happened to his radio before he fell, the battery died, and that's why he never made a call. But it's also definitely possible that the battery just drained over the course of the search. There were also apparently some gunshots heard in the area around the time of his injury, but when they found his body, they also found his firearm and they found all of his ammunition with none missing, which indicates that he had not fired his weapon. Another unanswered question that I have is actually about Ranger Christensen's choice of route that day. So apparently he had actually strayed from what he reported his planned route to be, and while he was off of his route, that's when he fell. His reasoning for straying from his planned route is not known, and it's certainly possible that he would have been found sooner if he had been on his planned route, because obviously that's where searchers zeroed in on after he disappeared. To this day, we still don't know why he decided to change his route on the fly, although I did hear it described as a quote shortcut in one of the articles that I read, so maybe he did it to just save some miles. I don't know. I'm probably overthinking this. It's just a very bizarre and complicated situation, and it's also worth mentioning that rescuers did not place any blame on Ranger Christensen for straying from his route. Apparently this is common practice for rangers, and it's totally within their rules and guidelines. They're allowed to leave their routes. His fall was also so severe that even if he had been found quickly on, his planned route, it's still unlikely that he would have survived, unfortunately. Rocky Mountain National Park's chief ranger at the time said, quote, "Had we known exactly where he was going, it's questionable whether we could have responded in a timely amount to get to such a remote area and get him evacuated to get the medical care he needed, which was essentially surgery." So leave a comment and let me know what you think of this story, and if you have any more questions about what happened, some unanswered questions, and if you have any feedback on it, please let me know. May Ranger Jeff Christensen rest in peace. My heart goes out to his friends and his family. Unfortunately, we'll probably never know the answers to the unanswered questions I've raised. And unfortunately, in our next story, there's an even more difficult unanswered question, if you can believe it. And I also think that I can pretty confidently say that we're never gonna find the answer to this one. Real quick, I'd like to call out Rocky Mountain Rescue Group, which is a volunteer search and rescue group based in Boulder County, Colorado. Now, I'm not sure if they were involved with the search for Ranger Christensen, but I did notice that they have a no charge for rescue policy, which is awesome in my opinion, and so they're going to be my give back call out for this week. I've made a donation to them, and I encourage you to do so as well. Even if it's just a few dollars, doesn't have to be anything crazy. I will have their website linked in the description. In the 1970s, Dwayne McClure landed what many outdoor enthusiasts would consider a dream job when he was hired as a park ranger in Yellowstone National Park. I've visited a pretty good amount of national parks in my 28-year life so far, but Yellowstone is one that I have not been to yet. And I think that's a shame because I'm sure that pretty much all of you are familiar with it. It's widely regarded as one of the most beautiful national parks in all of the United States. And so, I'd really like to visit. By May of 1980, Ranger McClure had been working for the National Park Service for 10 years, and I'm almost certain that he had been gathering experience in the outdoors for far longer than that. One of the outdoor pursuits that Ranger McClure was quite skilled at was canoeing. Now, some of you might think that canoeing is like super easy. I mean, you're just out there paddling casually. What's the big deal? It can definitely be easy like this, don't get me wrong, but there is a big difference between paddling around on like a calm pond in the middle of the summer and paddling on a remote lake in the spring when the water is extremely cold and the wind is picking up. You can probably tell how things can go wrong in that situation. You know, you got to be careful in those situations. That situation is unfortunately exactly what Ranger McClure paddled into on the morning of May 22nd, 1980. Not only was Ranger McClure a skilled canoeist, but he was also known to be, quote, precise and cautious. Because of that, it was very concerning when he didn't return from his planned patrol of the south shore of West Thumb on Yellowstone Lake. Attempts to contact him by radio failed, and so the National Park Service quickly jumped into action and launched a search for the missing ranger. And after they did this, it didn't take long for them to find a disturbing clue. So early in the morning, the following day after he went missing, Ranger McClure's canoe was found on a remote beach roughly a mile from his intended destination. But the thing is, his canoe wasn't found like pulled up neatly on the beach or tied down to anything. It was found in a condition known as swamped. Essentially, the canoe had been overturned, it was filled with water, and it had drifted ashore. Obviously, that was a very disturbing find, but it was also a major clue. Searchers hoped that the overturned canoe would lead them to Ranger McClure's location. I mean, it's not unheard of for people to get thrown out of their canoe to wash up on shore, and then still be located alive. Unfortunately, though, that is not what happened in Ranger McClure's situation. They didn't find any additional gear in the canoe. They didn't find any footprints that led away from the canoe. And worst of all, they just could not find any sign of Ranger McClure himself. They didn't give up there, obviously. They continued their search efforts after they discovered the swamp canoe, but unfortunately, they were never able to locate the missing ranger. His case basically went cold, and roughly a year after he disappeared, he was declared legally dead. I guess he officially remains missing to this day. It's a very strange and mysterious case, and so the obvious question here is, what the hell happened to him? So, due to his canoe washing up on shore, it's presumed that he drowned, of course. Yellowstone Lake has extremely cold water, especially in the spring when he was out there. So if he did fall out of the canoe and he was like too far away from the shore to swim and get to safety, he would have undoubtedly become hypothermic, and it would have happened fast. And so my unanswered question isn't so much, how Ranger McClure died, because that is almost certainly what happened. My unanswered question is, how did his canoe capsize in the first place? And also, how come his body was never recovered? This is very disturbing because the weather and the conditions on the day that he went missing were reportedly fine. There was apparently some wind on the lake that day, but it wasn't anything extreme. And as an experienced and skilled canoeist, Ranger McClure would have almost certainly been more than equipped to deal with this. And besides, my understanding is that his route would have mostly been hugging the shore of the lake. I'm not 100% on that, but from looking at maps, that's what it seems like. I don't think he was intending to be out like miles in open water exposed like that. Although again, that's an assumption. I just don't understand what could have caused him to swamp his canoe. And again, it's also so strange that his body was never found. At this point, I hate to say it, but it's unlikely that we're ever gonna get answers to those questions, but you never know, I guess. Leave a comment and let me know what you think happened here, and just let me know what you think of this sad story. My heart goes out to Ranger McClure, and may he rest in peace. Though his fate is a mystery, there's never been any indication, at least that I'm aware of, that foul play was involved with his disappearance. I think it's important to note that. But for this next story, that was definitely not the case. So let's flash forward to 2012. New Year's Day 2012 to be exact. On this day, Margaret Anderson arrived at Mount Rainier National Park to begin another day working as a park ranger. So other than the fact that it was the first day of the year, there really shouldn't have been anything else different about her shift that day. Now, it was the middle of the winter, and so the roads were icy and they were dangerous, and therefore it fell on park rangers to enforce tire chain laws to ensure that everyone who entered the park would also leave the park safely. Unfortunately, on this day, there would be 2 individuals that would not make it out of Mount Rainier National Park alive. Now, one of them died in the line of duty, trying to keep the park and its visitors and their fellow rangers safe, and the other one died as a result of a desperate and futile attempt to avoid paying for their crimes. In the early morning hours on Sunday, January 1st, 2012, 24-year-old Benjamin Barnes was involved in a shooting in Seattle, which this allegedly happened over a dispute about a firearm, apparently. The shooting was the tipping point in Barnes's life, a life that had been sliding downhill for quite some time. Barnes had been enlisted in the United States Army, and he even served some time in Iraq, apparently, but he was eventually kicked out of the Army after getting arrested for DUI, among a few other things. I know that he had recently lost a friend, an Army friend, due to suicide. He had also been recently dumped by his girlfriend because of increasingly volatile behavior on his part, and he was considered so dangerous at this point that he was only allowed to visit his daughter when he was supervised. And so by the time the first day of 2012 rolled around, Barnes was reportedly, at rock bottom. He was homeless and he was living out of his car in the middle of the winter. So this dispute in Seattle happens. Up to 4 people are shot, and then Benjamin Barnes, he fled town, and for some reason he went right for Mount Rainier National Park. He must have made it through the park entrance gate without incident, but he eventually did drive up to a ranger checkpoint between the Longmire and Paradise areas of the national park. The park's spokesman would go on to state that Barnes's vehicle, quote, blew through that checkpoint and didn't stop. And this obviously got the attention of the park rangers, who immediately initiated a high-speed pursuit of Barnes and also called ahead for backup. Ranger Margaret Anderson was stationed further up the road near Paradise, I guess, and when she heard about the vehicle chase that was heading her way, she decided to move her vehicle into the road in order to block the suspect. Her and one of her fellow rangers that she was with made an on-the-spot decision to attempt to arrest Barnes before he made it further into the park, further into an area that had large amounts of innocent park visitors that could potentially be harmed by him. Barnes drove up to Anderson's vehicle, and then he apparently did a U-turn before jumping out and opening fire on Anderson and her fellow ranger using a high-powered rifle. This all happened, in just a split second. It happened so quickly, in fact, that Anderson didn't even have a chance to draw her gun, let alone actually return fire and defend herself. So he's firing on these rangers, and he actually missed Anderson's partner, but unfortunately, he didn't miss Anderson. He hit her, and she was quickly able to alert authorities, I'm assuming over the radio, that she had been shot, but unfortunately, she did not survive for much longer after this. Her partner ended up driving away after this initial gunfire, and when backup did finally arrive, they were also fired upon by Barnes as they attempted to retrieve her out of her vehicle. So that obviously slowed things down, and by the time they reached her, she had already passed. Super sad. She is survived by her husband, who's also a park ranger at Mount Rainier National Park, apparently, and she's also survived by her 2 daughters. So after the shooting, Benjamin Barnes just abandoned his vehicle, and he fled into the harsh winter wilderness of Mount Rainier National Park. The park was immediately closed to new visitors after this happened. I believe that those who were already in the park were forced to either evacuate or to shelter inside the park's buildings. It was obviously a very tense and dangerous situation. A massive manhunt was launched, and the authorities even brought in helicopters with infrared cameras, as well as other aircraft, and of course, hundreds of law enforcement agents who were searching on foot. And because it was the middle of the winter, there was up to 5 feet of snow in many areas throughout the search perimeter, which definitely complicated the search efforts. But of course, this very same factor would also complicate things for the fleeing suspect, who was not equipped to be traveling through the snow or equipped to survive a freezing cold night for that matter. These harsh winter conditions proved to be too challenging for Barnes, because the following morning, he was found dead near the base of a popular waterfall for hikers to visit. When they found Barnes, it was immediately apparent that he was only wearing a t-shirt, jeans, and one shoe. By the way, when they found him, it was apparent that he had not taken his own life, and obviously law enforcement didn't kill him. He had died because of the extreme cold. He was found completely defeated, lying face down in a creek. He was laying there dead right where he belonged, and I'll admit that this story isn't quite as mysterious as the previous two, but I still wanted to include it in order to illustrate the sacrifice that park rangers rarely but do sometimes have to make. And I do still have a few questions about this story as well. My first question is, why the hell did Barnes choose Mount Rainier National Park as his place to run to? Now, on one hand, I kind of get it, because maybe he thought a national park would mean like lots of deserted wilderness and easy places to hide, which, I mean, there is a lot of deserted wilderness in Mount Rainier National Park. But on the other hand, he had apparently been to the park on many occasions. So therefore, he would have known that it would be crawling with park rangers, there'd be law enforcement there, and he also would have known that he would have had to go through a gate to even enter the park. One thing I could not find an answer to for some reason while I was researching is if this gate is manned during the winter. But either way, this entrance gate is basically a permanent checkpoint that he 100% would have known about. And so if he's on the run, why didn't he go to one of Washington State's numerous national forests and other public land wilderness that would have zero law enforcement present, especially in the winter? I don't know, if he was trying to hide, it just seems like those would be a better option than a heavily trafficked, heavily regulated national park. But anyways, speaking of the gate, the entrance to Mount Rainier National Park, again, I'm wondering, how did he get through this gate without any problems? Maybe it's not manned in the winter. Leave a comment if you know the answer to this. I just couldn't find the answer for some reason. And so if it's not manned, then that kind of explains it. But I mean, either way, the fact that he ran from the checkpoint further into the park makes me feel like he would have not wanted to stop at the park's entrance gate. And so I'm not sure what happened there. And also, why the hell did he run at the checkpoint in the first place? I mean, if he had been stopped, he probably would have just been sent on his way if he had chains, or he would have been turned around if he didn't have chains. These are all interesting questions, but then again, Benjamin Barnes was on the run. He was possibly intoxicated, and he was definitely not thinking straight, so maybe asking these final questions is just kind of pointless. At the end of the day, he was probably just acting on instinct, and I really doubt that there was any logic involved in his decision making. And because of him, the National Park Service lost a selfless ranger, and Margaret Anderson's daughters and her husband, well, they lost their mom, and he lost his wife. May Ranger Margaret Anderson rest in peace. My heart goes out to her family and all the families of any fallen law enforcement officers for that matter. June 14th, 1969. This was a day that Bill Martin would never forget. He should have been in the midst of a fun camping trip with his sons, but instead, he found himself in the middle of every father's worst case scenario. It was the day before his son Dennis's 7th birthday, and instead of celebrating, Bill found himself bolting through the woods of the Smoky Mountains, shouting Dennis's name at the top of his lungs. The boy had vanished from their campsite, and Bill was desperate to find any sign of Dennis. He shouted and shouted, but Dennis never shouted back. That evening, the sky opened up, inflicting high winds, booming thunderclaps, and nearly 3 inches of rain on Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Bill Martin had no choice but to just hunker down inside an Appalachian Trail shelter, knowing full well that his son was still out there among feral hogs, dangerous snakes, and black bears. Due to all of this and the bad weather, it seemed basically impossible for Dennis Martin to survive the night. The next morning, park rangers swung into action, searching flooded trails by foot and washed out roads by jeep. By the afternoon, almost 250 people were combing through the woods, and the next day, that number increased to 300 people, and then 365. Within a week, over 1,000 people reported for duty, each one of them eager to find Dennis Martin. And as more and more people showed up, the search descended into absolute chaos. One searcher fell off a bridge, another shot himself in the leg by accident, and a group of Green Berets trudged so deep into the woods that they ran out of food and had to barbecue a rattlesnake. What started as just one desperate father searching through the woods all by himself had quickly evolved into one of the largest and messiest search operations in national park history. And yet, not one damn thing came of it. Absolutely nothing. This is the mysterious disappearance of Dennis Martin. To start off, let's head to the most visited national park in the United States, that is Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Now, instead of charging you an admission fee, all I ask is that you hit that subscribe button, especially if you're a repeat viewer and you've found yourself watching a number of my videos now. That's right, I'm talking to you. Thanks. On Father's Day weekend, 1969, the Martin family left their home in Knoxville, Tennessee, and headed to the Smoky Mountains. The group consisted of 6-year-old Dennis, 9-year-old Douglas, their father Bill, and their grandfather Clyde. The trip to Great Smoky Mountains National Park was a family tradition for them, and this was actually Dennis's first time going camping. Dennis Martin was about 4 feet tall and weighed 55 pounds. And though he had never been camping before, he had been on day hikes in the past, and reportedly he walked so fast that the adults couldn't always keep up with him. By all accounts, he was comfortable and happy being in the woods. The Martin family started their adventure from Cades Cove Campground on Friday, and from there they hiked up to the Appalachian Trail, which runs right along the dividing ridge between North Carolina and Tennessee. It was perfect hiking weather, and I'm sure the group was absolutely thrilled to get to their first campsite of the trip at Russell Field Shelter. They spent the night here, and then the next day, they decided to take it a little bit easier, this time only hiking a few miles north on the Appalachian Trail to the next campsite, Spence Field. And when they arrived at Spence Field, they set up camp, and they had no idea what was about to happen next. Nearly 50 years later, I actually did the exact same thing in the exact same spot when I thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail. It was now 2018, and I'll be honest, at the time, I had no idea about how infamous of a place Spence Field was. I honestly might have rethought my decision had I known about the next series of events in this story. At Spence Field, the Martins were joined by some family friends, and sometime in the afternoon, the group sat down to relax. Camp was set up, lunch had been consumed, and the dishes had even been done. So there wasn't much else for the adults to do besides sit there and take in the scenery. For the young boys, however, it was playtime, and the grassy knoll that they were camped out on was the perfect spot for it. Dennis, Douglas, and 2 other boys that they were with hatched a devious plan to sneak up on all the adults and surprise them. But unbeknownst to the boys, the adults were onto them, and they actually watched and laughed as the group of boys split up. Douglas and the 2 boys went to the south, and Dennis went by himself to the north and west towards the Tennessee side of the ridge. All of the adults pretended to be surprised when the boys jumped out at them, and rounds of laughter quickly followed. However, within no more than 5 minutes, nobody was laughing, because it's at this point that they finally realized that Dennis had gone missing. Dennis was wearing a red t-shirt at the time, and it's because of this that the boys actually planned for him to sneak around on his own so that his red shirt wouldn't give them away. Bill, Dennis's father, and Clyde, Dennis's grandfather, started calling out Dennis's name, but they heard and saw nothing in return. Getting more and more desperate, they sprung into action and began searching the trails in the surrounding area. Bill Martin traveled south on the Appalachian Trail for about a mile before returning back to Spence Field, hoping that his son would be there waiting for him. When he realized that Dennis was still lost, Bill set out south once again, this time hiking the 2.5 miles back to Russell Field, where they had camped that first night. But once again, he was forced to return to Spence Field without his son. And also, once again, when he arrived back, Dennis was not there. While Bill was desperately searching along the Appalachian Trail, Clyde made his way off the ridge. He hiked over 8 miles back down to Cades Cove Campground, and when he arrived, he reached a ranger station. He reported Dennis Martin missing at roughly 8:30 p.m. that night, the day before the boy's 7th birthday. This marked the start of a search effort which would turn into more and more of a cluster with each passing day. Excuse my harsh language there, but I think you're gonna realize what I mean in just a second. That first night that Dennis was reported missing, the search was quite limited. In addition to the searching that Bill and Clyde had done, rangers interviewed hikers at Spence Field who had traveled in from various directions and trails. None of these hikers interviewed had noticed anything out of the ordinary, let alone actually seen Dennis. And then that night, a massive storm rolled through the Smoky Mountains, dumping down almost 3 inches of rain in just the span of a few hours. This was extremely unlucky for the search, obviously, but it's also not exactly uncommon. I mean, they are called the Smoky Mountains after all. They're known for volatile weather, and they're actually technically a rainforest. But regardless of what's expected or not expected, these thunderstorms were bad news for the search. Not only did the weather slow down the search right when it was at its most critical point, I mean, the boy had only disappeared a few hours earlier, but after it passed, it left Spence Field and the surrounding area, the entire Great Smoky Mountains National Park, mind you, a muddy, flooded mess. This would hinder the pace of searching the next morning, and it would also potentially cover up important clues and evidence about where Dennis Martin could have ended up. And also, let's just be frank here, it could have killed the boy. Without shelter, he could have easily become hypothermic or been swept away in a flash flood. I mean, it's just not a good situation. Searchers knew this could have been the case, but regardless, they ramped up their efforts the next day. By the afternoon, there was 240 people in the park searching for Dennis. His mother had also arrived at this point after learning at church that her boy was missing, by the way. Super sad. And from there, the number of searchers started to balloon at an absolutely ridiculous rate. Within a week, 1,400 people, some official searchers, many just volunteers, descended upon the Smoky Mountains, all of them eager to find the missing boy. Groups ranging from the Boy Scouts all the way up to the Green Berets showed up. Helicopters, dogs, and even loudspeakers were used, blasting the boy's name, trying to find any sign of him. President Nixon himself even contacted park officials, telling them that he would be following the search. And one might think that there's strength in numbers in a situation like this, but it's actually at this point that the search really started to just fall apart. The magnitude of this search effort had never been seen before, and organizing it was all but impossible. Some volunteers reportedly didn't even know how to use a compass or other important searching tools. At one point, a volunteer actually fell off a bridge and broke his arm, requiring medical attention. And then another searcher accidentally shot himself in the leg, requiring even more intense medical attention. And those Green Berets that I mentioned, well, they would end up hiking themselves so deep into the woods that they ran out of food and had to kill and barbecue a rattlesnake in order to sustain themselves. I'm gonna quote from retired park ranger Dwight McCarter, who was involved in the search from the morning after Dennis went missing. He said, "All of those people, that's a lot of footprints. All those trucks. We searched and searched. Something should have been found, but you have to know what to look for. Get just a few of us trackers in first and give us a chance." Clearly, he and lots of other people were worried that such a large number of people, especially people who weren't really trained in searching, were just going to be trampling over evidence, missing things. I mean, it was just an absolute disaster. But with that said, the obvious reason that so many people volunteered is because, well, it's a 7-year-old boy after all. It's a case that really just tugs at people's heartstrings. And so while I am obviously criticizing the search efforts, I do just want to take a moment to acknowledge the heart and determination that all of the searchers displayed, even if at the end of the day, it might have kind of been, a total disaster. Despite over 1,000 people searching and all the efforts, Dennis Martin was never located and hardly any evidence was ever found. It basically just seemed like he up and vanished, as though the Smoky Mountains had simply swallowed him whole. However, there was one potential clue discovered on day 4 of the search. Now, this clue didn't end up leading searchers to Dennis, but it did give us a glimpse into what might have happened to the missing boy. In the vicinity of Eagle Creek, which was roughly a mile away from where Dennis Martin was last seen, by the way, some hikers discovered suspicious-looking footprints leading off of a trail. Intrigued, they followed the footprints as far as they could, some 300 yards, before finally losing them at the edge of one of the many flooded streams in the area. Now, on first thought, these footprints could have belonged to anybody, right? Well, a closer examination provided evidence that the footprints might have actually belonged to Dennis. First of all, one of the prints was from a bare foot, and the other print was from a shoe. This would be consistent with a lost, desperate boy roaming around in the woods. Second of all, the prints were found at a confusing junction with a water break, which looks very much like a trail and could easily confuse a child into following it. And lastly, both prints were small. You could even describe them as child-sized. A cast was made of the prints, but the Martin family felt as though the prints were too big for Dennis's feet. And it didn't take long for an explanation about these prints to emerge. The tracks were supposedly left by Boy Scouts, which would explain the small feet size. And besides, the Green Berets confirmed that they had already searched this area, and they insisted that they would have found Dennis if he was nearby. But still, it's kind of hard to look back today and completely discount this evidence like they did at the time. I mean, first of all, the footprints were that of one single child, not an entire Boy Scout troop, so that explanation really doesn't make sense. And also, there's no way that the Boy Scouts would have been searching without shoes on through this tough terrain. And so, unfortunately, the only clue that resulted from this massive search was never properly followed up on, and we'll really never know how much validity it had. There were a few more clues into the disappearance of Dennis Martin, but these clues all came in after the official search had already been suspended. More than a month after the disappearance, a man came forward and claimed that while visiting Cades Cove on Father's Day weekend, the same weekend that Dennis disappeared, he witnessed something suspicious. The man claimed that he was hiking off trail and was quoted saying, "When we got about half a mile or maybe 3/4 of a mile from the car, we heard a scream. A troubling scream, an enormous, sickening scream. We couldn't tell which direction it came from, but it sounded like it came from higher on the mountain to me. I looked across the creek and saw a man in the bushes. I couldn't tell much about him because he was going down the creek towards the cars. He was definitely trying to keep from being seen. I thought maybe he was a moonshiner." And then, this man that I was quoting allegedly found a homemade map located right where this creepy man that he had seen was standing. And he also noticed that this creepy man had likely driven off in an older model white Chevrolet. And so this story certainly sounded promising, but after investigating, officials ended up concluding that it was unrelated to Dennis Martin's disappearance. They believed that the man's location at the time was too far away from Spence Field for Dennis to have traveled there in the timeline presented. And thus, the second real lead in the case hit a dead end, and it would be years before the next lead would present itself. 16 years to be exact. In 1985, a man came forward and reported that he had discovered the remains of a small child in the area of Big Hollow near Tremont, Tennessee, deep inside the national park. This discovery was supposedly made some 3 to 4 miles straight line from where Dennis Martin was last seen. The area was searched by up to 30 men, but nothing was ever found. The man who made this report said that he had actually found the body a number of years earlier, but he neglected to tell officials because he was illegally hunting ginseng at the time. So he was afraid that he would end up getting arrested for that if he reported this thing that was completely unrelated. It's really, really frustrating. And thus, this lead would also prove to be a dead end and the last major lead that I'm aware of. Despite the biggest search in Great Smoky Mountains National Park's history, which still holds true to this day, by the way, one of the biggest searches in national park history, period, 54 years have passed, 54, and we still don't know what happened to Dennis Martin. It's reported that some family members believe he was kidnapped, and this would certainly line up with the story about the suspicious man in the woods, but the fact is, zero evidence of this exists. Hell, we don't even have a suspect's name. Now, it's also possible that Dennis was the unfortunate victim of one of the thousands of black bears in the Smoky Mountains. Or maybe he was bitten by a rattlesnake, or a copperhead, or a cottonmouth. Or, in the most likely scenario, Dennis just got lost in the woods and couldn't find his way back due to the storm that night and just ended up dying due to exposure. This is the theory that lead investigators believe to be the most likely, but in my opinion, we're probably never gonna know exactly what happened. We do know, however, that a search will never be handled in the same unorganized manner ever again. The search for Dennis Martin has been analyzed and critiqued for decades, and it actually serves as a case study on what not to do. The National Park Service completely revamped its search and rescue plans after this, and never again will such a large influx of untrained and unorganized volunteers be allowed to just trample through an active search zone. The search for Dennis Martin cost $70,000 at the time, over $500,000 in today's money, and Bill Martin, Dennis's father, died in 2014 without any closure on his son's disappearance. Today, Spence Field has been taken over by tree growth, and it hardly resembles a field anymore. It hardly resembles the site that was once the location for one of the most mysterious disappearances in national park history. My heart goes out to Dennis Martin, Bill Martin, and the rest of the Martin family, and though this case is sad, the silver lining is that it directly resulted in improved search procedures throughout the world and has likely saved many, many lives. I think this photo right here is one of the most disturbing photos in national park history. It might look somewhat normal at first. I mean, it's just a van parked on a dirt road after all, but the story about why this van was parked there and the fate of those who parked it is incredibly disturbing. That van was found in an area that, by all reasonable accounts, should have been basically impossible for it to reach. An area so rough and inhospitable that it would go on to swallow the van's occupants whole and launch a decade-long mystery that yielded all sorts of wild conspiracy theories. Where the hell had the van's occupants disappeared to? Who were they? And of course, why and how did they manage to get their van so deep into this remote desert? The US government tried and failed to locate the van's occupants, and eventually the case basically just went cold. But then, literally years later, by the way, the case would suddenly be blown wide open due to a discovery from a private citizen with a knack for reading topography and maybe a little too much time on his hands. So with all that said, folks, this is the disturbing story of the Death Valley Germans. So this is one of the most, if not the most unique story that I've ever covered on this channel. And the reason that I say that is because it's basically two separate stories wrapped up into one. There's the story of the missing Germans, of course, but then there's also the story of the man who just about hiked himself to death trying to find them years and years later. I'm gonna attempt to tie everything together, but honestly, it might take a while, so make sure you watch all the way until the end of the video. And with that said, we're now gonna take a virtual trip to the beautiful yet dangerous Death Valley National Park. This trip is totally free, but you must hit the subscribe button to cover your admission, especially if you're a repeat viewer of the channel. I appreciate you guys very much. If you're a new viewer and you end up enjoying this video, then I give you permission to wait until the end of the video to subscribe, and I'll be sure to remind you. On October 21st, 1996, Park Ranger David Brenner was conducting some routine aerial surveillance over Death Valley National Park when he noticed an incredibly strange sight down on the ground. In the valley of Anvil Canyon, there was a seemingly abandoned minivan. I mean, just sitting there. So he sees this from the sky, and as soon as he saw it, by the way, this ranger knew that something had to have gone wrong and that this vehicle needed to be investigated immediately. And so he landed his small plane nearby and he walked over to check out this van. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, the area that this minivan was located in is incredibly remote, it's rugged, and especially in the summertime, I mean, it's extremely dangerous. I'm sure many of you already know this, or perhaps you've heard this, but Death Valley is known for being literally the hottest place on Earth. It's totally unforgiving, and it's claimed many, many lives over the years. So back to this minivan, it turned out to be a green Plymouth Voyager, and the road that it was found on, I mean, you can't even really call it a road. I mean, it was basically an abandoned path that had not been used in years. This road was also located within a designated wilderness area, which meant that vehicles were prohibited from traveling on it. And with that said, however, it's not exactly unheard of for folks to ignore the law and ride their like recreational or four-wheel drive vehicles in these remote areas. Obviously, that does happen. But again, this wasn't a side-by-side. This wasn't a four-wheeler. I mean, this vehicle didn't even have four-wheel drive. It was just a standard minivan. It was like a soccer mom van, essentially, right? It's pretty much the last type of vehicle that you would expect to find on a long since abandoned remote dirt road. Whoever had driven the van to this location must have been either extremely skilled at driving or extremely lucky to have made it that far down the abandoned path. I mean, by conventional wisdom, it would have seemed pretty much impossible for this van to be where it was without it basically being airdropped by a plane or a helicopter or something. But obviously that's ridiculous. It was clear at the scene that the van had not been airdropped and had somehow traveled through the rough terrain all the way until its final resting place. And we know this because 3 out of the 4 tires on the van were completely flat and it was just stuck there in the sand. So Ranger Brenner, who found this van, recorded the license plate, he reported it, and it's at this point in the story that the details behind this mysterious van began to unravel, at least some of these details. So they ran the plates of this abandoned minivan, and they found out that it was a rental. In fact, it had actually been reported stolen out of Los Angeles by its owner, which was Dollar Car Rentals, and it was reported stolen about a month-ish before it was discovered. And so, naturally, the question is, who were the last people to have the car before it disappeared? And the last people that had rented it were actually a group of German tourists. They were 34-year-old Egbert Rimkus, his 11-year-old son, George Weber, Egbert's 28-year-old girlfriend named Cornelia Connie Mayer, and then her 4-year-old son named Max Mayer. Now, the Germans had been supposed to return the rental car on July 26th, but despite not doing this, not returning it, the rental car company actually waited over a month before they finally reported it stolen. So the fact that they never returned the car was obviously very concerning, but what was even more concerning potentially was that the Germans had booked a return flight out of Los Angeles on July 27th, but they never boarded this flight. They never showed up, and no other flight records or any indication that they had left the United States was ever found. So using the very few clues available to them, the authorities began piecing together the German group's timeline. I mean, they were trying to understand how their vehicle had ended up in such a remote and desolate place. So they did all this research, and here's basically what they found. The Germans had landed in Los Angeles on July 8th, rented that minivan, and then spent about a week sightseeing around San Clemente, California. They actually found a camera roll, like a film camera roll inside the van, and so they developed those photos. And through this, investigators discovered that the Germans had traveled to Las Vegas next, and then they went on to Death Valley National Park. By the time they got there, the date was July 22nd, which is quite literally the hottest time of the year in the hottest place on Earth. Inside of the minivan, investigators also found a few opened and unopened bottles of Bud Ice beer. They found some camping equipment, they found a few bank cards, and they found several empty, completely empty containers for water. They continued to piece together the Germans' timeline, and thanks to a few remote logbooks the group had signed out in the national park, investigators were able to determine that on July 23rd, the Germans had tried to drive an extremely rough road over Mengel Pass. We don't know exactly what happened here, but we do know that they couldn't make it. And so they eventually changed directions and headed down into Anvil Canyon, which is where their vehicle eventually gave out on them. The estimated temperature for the area that day was a high of 107 degrees Fahrenheit, or roughly 42 degrees Celsius. By October 23rd, as investigators were still piecing everything together, mind you, a search was finally launched, or more likely at that point, I think it would be safe to say it was a body recovery mission, unfortunately. And on this search, it didn't take very long before another important clue was discovered, and searchers probably felt that they would be closing out the mystery of the Death Valley Germans very quickly at this point. On this search, they found an empty Bud Ice beer bottle, roughly 1.7 miles east of where the minivan was abandoned. The scene kind of looked like someone had sat down next to this bush probably to try to get some shade because, again, this is the desert. It's super hot. There's no trees or anything, is my understanding. So they sat down and maybe they drank this beer or they had it with them and then they just kind of left it there. This recovered beer bottle was matched with the other beer bottles that were found in the minivan, so they didn't believe it was a coincidence. They were pretty confident that it was left there by somebody who was in that van. Though this was definitely a promising initial clue, it was pretty much the only clue that the first search discovered. And by the way, this first search was a massive effort. I'm talking over 200 people searching, multiple helicopters. I mean, they had horses, and they spent roughly equivalent to $150,000 in today's money, and yet no sign of the Germans was found. They searched and searched, but then eventually on October 26th, the search was called off. So this case is obviously super strange so far and just very perplexing. And because of that, it received quite a bit of news media attention at the time. And because of that, in the years that followed 1996, a number of search and rescue teams, as well as just private individuals, conducted their own unofficial searches. On these searches, a few potential clues were found, mainly a discarded sleeping bag and 2 alleged German canteens, but these clues were never definitively tied to the missing Germans. And so, as tends to happen in cases like this, as the case grew colder and colder and more time went by, theories and speculation obviously grew stronger and stronger. One theory was that Egbert Rimkus wanted to sneak onto the nearby China Lake Naval Air Weapons Station, and in the process of doing this, he basically ended up being disappeared by the government after maybe seeing something that he shouldn't have. I don't know about that. Another theory was that they ran into some sort of foul play while driving through the backcountry, and then their bodies were disposed of and the van was ditched as a result. Again, I don't know. Some people even believe that they were abducted by aliens. I mean, I'm telling you, there was all sorts of wild stuff going around. In fact, one of the most popular conspiracy theories, I guess, if you could even call it that, was that the Germans had pulled off an elaborate scheme to stage their disappearance and then run off to start new lives. Apparently, Egbert had been going through some custody troubles with his ex-wife back in Germany, which I guess would have given him a possible motive to run off like this. And he also apparently had been talking a lot before he disappeared about up and moving to Costa Rica or something. So I don't know, there were all these theories and, the case was getting a lot of attention, but no hard evidence or even soft evidence for that matter of any of these conspiracy theories existed. But with that said, there is of course one more theory that could have explained the disappearance of the Death Valley Germans, and this theory wouldn't have been popular with the folks, going through these wild theories and stuff, but it was probably the most obvious explanation. This theory held that the Germans had simply made some bad decisions, gotten lost as a result, then the van broke down, and then they had no choice but to try to walk through the desert back to safety, and well, they died while doing that. However, skeptics argued that this was basically impossible because of how thoroughly the area had been searched following their disappearance. I mean, if they were still in the desert, within walking distance, of course, from the abandoned van, surely they would have been found, right? Well, according to a man named Tom Mahood, the answer to that question was no, not necessarily. Tom Mahood theorized that the bodies were still, in fact, out there. And over 10 years after the case had gone cold, he set out on foot himself to prove it. At the beginning of the video, I told you this was like 2 different stories wrapped up into one. Well, this is the start of the second part, I guess, of this overall story. Tom Mahood was a private citizen who, in 2008, became oddly obsessed with the case of the missing Death Valley Germans. My understanding is that the case inspired him to join a local volunteer search and rescue team called Riverside Mountain Rescue Unit, like the year after he discovered the case, where he then began honing his search skills and also picking the brains of other members of the search and rescue team about the case. Tom Mahood then spent most of 2009 researching about the Germans and their disappearance, hoping that he would somehow uncover some new information that hadn't been readily available in the media and at this point online. Mahood felt as though something was missing in the public reporting about this case. He just felt like there had to be more. Something just wasn't right. And so he just started digging. He dug and dug. He spent countless hours poring over topography maps of the area before finally setting out to visit the minivan site himself in October of 2009. Tom Mahood was able to obtain the GPS coordinates of where the van was found, and also he was able to get the coordinates of where the empty bottle of beer was found further down the trail. He parked at the remote Anvil Canyon, and then he set out, like I said earlier, on foot through this desolate desert. He eventually reached the location of the van, which had long since been removed, by the way, obviously, and he then climbed up to a vantage point to take some photos, later saying, quote, "As I climbed up on the bank of the wash to the south to take overall pictures, it suddenly struck me that Egbert probably did the same thing and was at the same spot on the bank to get an overview of where they were. It was a very eerie feeling." Tom Mahood then continued on to the bottle site before eventually returning back to his car. He ended up hiking about 12 miles in 7 hours, and this is some hard hiking, by the way. And even though he was exhausted by the end, this initial visit to the desert would prove to be incredibly useful for him. He didn't discover any new clues necessarily, but simply just placing himself in the exact same spot that the Germans had been before they disappeared. I mean, this is incredible. It allowed him, in a sense, I guess, to kind of put himself in their shoes. He, quote, "soaked up the ambience of the area," and he also took a first-hand look at what the Germans were dealing with when their van eventually gave out on them. A few days after Mahood returned home, his hike through the desert ended up paying off big time, because suddenly, a very promising theory, one that fit with all the known information and all the clues, well, it kind of just jumped out to him. Tom Mahood said, quote, "On October 29th, only 2 days after my hike, I was at home looking at an overall map of Death Valley. Like viewing one of those optical illusions where an image suddenly pops out, everything just fell into place and became visible. I suddenly saw a way the Germans could have ended up in Anvil Canyon through a series of reasonable, honest mistakes." So he comes up with this theory, and by the way, this theory was incredibly detailed and honestly incredibly complicated, especially if you're not really familiar with this area. I'm gonna do my absolute best to explain it in like simple terms, though I will say that if you'd like an even more detailed view into the theory and his entire mission for that matter, he wrote up an excellent blog about this case that I will link in the description. In fact, much of the information that I'm sharing with you today has been derived from his blog, and so once again, I suggest you go check it out, especially if you want even more information about this case. So there were basically two unknown questions that Mahood had to kind of formulate a theory around. These questions were, number one, why did the Germans' van end up where it did? And second of all, what the hell happened to them after the van broke down? Mahood knew that the Germans had purchased a Death Valley guidebook that apparently highlighted several routes through the desert that weren't exactly suitable for a minivan, to put it lightly. He thought that it seemed likely that the Germans didn't understand how bad the roads would be, and so they kind of set out and made it all the way to Mengel Pass before realizing they couldn't go any further and then turning around. But rather than just retracing the route that they came in on, they were looking at the map and they decided to take a gamble in order to save some time on their trip, which caused them to eventually turn onto Anvil Canyon Road. They had been in the United States for a little while at this point. Their trip was coming to an end, but they still wanted to go see Yosemite National Park after leaving Death Valley, and they probably feared that they would run out of time to make this last trip, if they had to kind of retrace their steps and drive out the way that they came in. And so, yeah, they took a gamble. They went on this road that was extremely rough, and they went as far as they could, but eventually the van's tires, they gave out, and the group was essentially stranded in the desert in the middle of the summer. Mahood believed that after the van broke down, Egbert then walked the roughly 1.7 miles down Anvil Canyon to try and formulate a plan, I guess. And on this walk, he eventually stopped to try to sit in the shade next to this little bush and apparently drank a beer. He then left the bottle at this location and hiked back to the van, which is where the group apparently would have spent the night. He believes that the group spent at least one night at the van because cat holes were found nearby, which, if you don't know what that means, it basically means they had been digging holes to go to the bathroom, which indicates that they were at that location for at least some extended period of time. So that explains, why they ended up where they did, where the van broke down, but it doesn't explain where they went next or what happened, how they disappeared. And so let's get into that part of Mahood's theory now. Mahood believes that Egbert noticed the China Lake Naval Weapons Center on his map of the Death Valley area. Now, in Germany, or just in Europe in general, I guess, military installations like this are routinely patrolled on foot. And so Egbert would have assumed that if he could reach China Lake, he would encounter soldiers or guards, something like that, that could help out the stranded family. And this is obviously a very reasonable assumption for an international traveler in the US. But unfortunately, there were basically two main problems with this assumption. First of all, the China Lake Naval Weapons Center's property was not patrolled. And second of all, it was a treacherous 9-mile off-trail bushwhack in order to get there on foot. And with limited information at their disposal, the Germans probably underestimated just how dangerous this trek would be. And thus, the morning after they crashed the van, they locked it, and then they headed south on foot through the scorching desert into the last area that had not been searched after their disappearance. So that's essentially all of Mahood's theory. Again, I kind of dumbed it down a little bit, and you can read that blog to learn more. But after coming up with this theory, he plotted out a few potential southbound routes that the Germans might have taken on foot. And then, on November 11th, 2009, Mahood and one of his fellow search and rescue buddies named Les Walker set out on a multi-night journey to try and cover these tracks. Tom Mahood had his theory at this point, and so this trip was now the time to put it to test. So the men spent the first day kind of hiking in and finding and gathering water, and then setting up a base camp to kind of come back to every night. And so they do this, and then the next morning they wake up and they just started searching, right? They were eager to cover as much ground as they could in the limited amount of time that they had. They picked one of the routes, and then the two men spread out, roughly 100 yards away from each other, too far to talk, and so they each had these little radios that they used to communicate. The area that these two men were trying to cover was absolutely massive. So massive, in fact, that Mahood immediately realized that it would take multiple trips to search as he was kind of looking out over all this terrain. And also, just in case you needed a reminder, the men were miles away from any established trail in an area so remote that there was likely only a few people in history that had ever laid eyes on what they were looking at. The only reason that I even mention that is because I just think it's important context to show just how miraculous the next series of events I'm about to tell you about were. So again, this is the very first morning of the search. They get up, they start searching around 7 a.m., and then, not even 2 hours later, at 8:43 a.m., Tom Mahood heard a radio message from Walker that would blow the mystery of the Death Valley Germans literally wide open. Les Walker had found a discarded wine bottle, and this bottle looked quite old. Then, Walker found a few pieces of scrap paper, and on them were words that were written in, you guessed it, German. And then, shortly after this discovery, Walker announced over the radio, quote, "Tom, we have some bones here." At this point, Tom Mahood quickly raced down to join Walker, and as he was doing this, as he was moving over to kind of intercept his location, Walker found a wallet. And inside this wallet was multiple ID cards, and they all bore the name Cornelia Mayer. This confirmed that the two men acting on Mahood's theory had indisputably solved a massive piece of the Death Valley Germans mystery. The men continued searching around, and they did find a few more items, which included another Bud Ice beer can that matched the ones that were found in the van. And then after all these discoveries, obviously they were really onto something. And so they decided at this point to hike out and report their findings to the authorities. But before they left, they actually grabbed Cornelia's IDs in order to prove what they had discovered. So they hiked out through this incredibly difficult terrain, and eventually they reached their vehicle and they just started speeding straight towards the nearest ranger station. The men would then report their findings, and within days, the site of those remains would be swarming with investigators, searchers, and even FBI agents. Even more items would go on to be recovered over various trips to the site, and ultimately, the only DNA match on the remains was that of Egbert, although it is likely that some of the bones belonged to Cornelia as well. I mean, that makes sense, right? Especially given her wallet was found at the site. Unfortunately, part of this mystery remains all the way up until today, because the remains of the children were never found. Although possibly some of the bones might have appeared to be that of a child. We don't really have any conclusive evidence of this, but it is certainly a possibility, yeah. Mahood would end up going back multiple times after his initial discovery, at first to kind of, assist investigators since he was the one that discovered it and stuff, and then later to actually search for more clues. His repeated expeditions into the backcountry would end up taking a toll on his health, and after failing to find any new evidence, particularly of the children's fate, that's what he was kind of looking for at this point, he eventually retired from the case. I used air quotes there because, once again, Mahood was not acting in any, official capacity during his searches for the Death Valley Germans. Which, by the way, brings me to a very important point. When Mahood and Walker first reported their discovery to the authorities, they were actually given kind of an earful. They were scolded, essentially, and the reason for this is because the government does not like the idea of private citizens going out and potentially putting themselves at risk, or people that would then have to come rescue them at risk, just trying to be the hero who solves one of these famous cold cases. And I definitely understand that sentiment, but with that said, Mahood was an experienced hiker. He had actual search and rescue experience and training, so he was definitely very well equipped for this challenge. However, I just gotta say, unless you yourself fall into that same category, I cannot stress this enough, you should not, under any circumstance, take Mahood's story as inspiration to go out and try to replicate his actions and success. Again, if you're a search and rescue professional, you have all this experience, then, I can't tell you what to do, but if you're not experienced in the backcountry and you do this, you're very likely to get into trouble, and it could also very likely cost you your life. So don't even think about it. No, that's just an important point I had to make. And though Tom Mahood was acting independently, as I mentioned earlier, he was a member of the Riverside Mountain Rescue Unit, at least at some point in time. And thus, because of that, I've decided to make them my give back call out for this video. They're a volunteer, emphasis on the volunteer, search and rescue group. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, but I have made a donation to them, and I'd encourage you to check out their website, and please consider doing the same, even if it's just a few bucks or whatever. Volunteer search and rescue members are the unsung heroes of the backcountry. I keep saying this, and it's so true, so please join me in my mission to support them. Ultimately, it seems as though the Death Valley Germans made it roughly halfway to the China Lake Naval Air Weapons Station before, tragically but also unsurprisingly, succumbing to either like heat exhaustion or dehydration. Now, of course, we're never gonna know like their exact reasoning behind, driving the van to where they did and then all of that. But I don't know, I still think it's worth noting that you should definitely not ever attempt to follow remote roads that you have no information about or no intel on, especially in a place like Death Valley in the middle of the summer. If you do venture into the wilderness here, please bring tons of extra water and leave your plans with somebody just in case something goes wrong. I'd once again highly recommend that you go read Tom Mahood's full blog linked in the description, especially if you found this story fascinating. And also, please keep Egbert Rimkus, George Weber, Cornelia Mayer, and Max Mayer in your hearts.
On an early October day in 1999, two fishermen set out into Colorado's Comanche Peak wilderness on the Big South Trail. They followed the trail up through the most remote part of Poudre Canyon, looking for spots to cast in the river that the trail parallels. While the Big South Trail is certainly beautiful, this area in Colorado is home to tons of other scenic trails. Because of this, I'm sure that most people that hiked it at the time had pretty much forgotten its name by the time they returned to their cars. These two fishermen, however, would likely never forget the name Big South Trail for the rest of their lives. And that's because this trail was about to become one of the most famous hiking trails in Colorado, perhaps the entire country, at least for the time being. About 1.5 miles into their adventure, the two fishermen decided to take a break from casting and started to rest on the side of the trail. Shortly into this break, they were approached by a young boy, and I mean a really young boy, only a few years old. The encounter was brief, and the boy quickly continued on by himself down the trail. Now, encountering a lone child in the middle of the woods is usually a scenario reserved for nightmares or horror films, but the two fishermen were not that concerned. And that's because just a little bit further down the trail, the two fishermen could see a large group of hikers coming up towards them, and they assumed that this boy was simply just a part of that group. Their conversation, their encounter with the boy seemed brief and insignificant, and I guess at the time, it certainly was. However, their encounter with the boy would go on to be analyzed, discussed, and dissected for decades to come. And that's because the boy they ran into on the Big South Trail was no other than 3-year-old Jared Atadero. And this encounter was the last time that Jared was ever seen alive. This is one of those cases that's very famous. It has like a cult following. And so I guarantee you there's people that are going to watch this video that honestly know more about this case than I do. As I do with every single video that I make, I did my absolute best to make sure all the facts here are 100% true, but you never know. I could have gotten something wrong, and honestly, there could be some facts out there that I just didn't even find in my research. So if you're really familiar with this case, please leave some insight in the comments. And if this is your first time hearing about this case, please go watch some other videos, read some articles, just do more research. Don't just take everything you hear that I say as gospel. On Saturday, October 2nd, 1999, Alan Atadero woke up to a beautiful fall day in the mountains of Colorado. Atadero was the co-owner of the Poudre River Resort located in Rustic, Colorado, about an hour west of Fort Collins. He was currently staying at his resort with his two children, 3-year-old Jared and 6-year-old Jocelyn. On this particular morning, Alan's children had heard about a trip that was planned to the nearby State Fish Hatchery, and this trip was being led by the Christian Singles Network group, which was a group that was staying at the resort at the time, and it was also a group that Alan was a part of. Jared and his older sister wanted to go on the trip to the fish hatchery, and after some brief hesitation, Alan decided to let them go. What could possibly go wrong, he surely figured. For reasons that are unknown to me, this group decided to change their plans after they had already left, and unbeknownst to Alan. They decided to go for a hike. and they chose the Big South Trail, which was about 15.5 miles away from the resort. It's also unclear to me what this group of 11 people's objective on the hike was. The Big South Trail runs over 10 miles through the Comanche Peak Wilderness, eventually entering the boundaries of Rocky Mountain National Park, and it has several intersecting trails and other wilderness trails. There's no obvious end point on this trail for a day hike. That's what I'm getting at, so I'm not really sure why they chose it. I definitely could be missing something, but it seems like the group's plans were made quite hastily and they weren't really thought through very well. Nobody knows exactly what happened once everyone started hiking, but it's generally accepted that the hikers began to separate into two groups based on their speed. The faster group outpaced the slower group and pulled ahead. It's unknown which of the two groups Jared was a part of, but whatever group he was currently hiking with, he must have been feeling good because he actually ran ahead of the group, and that's when he encountered the two fishermen that I spoke about in the intro of this video. At this point, they were roughly 1.5 miles into the trail and they were in the vicinity of Camp 2. There's 16 designated campsites for backpackers to use along the Big South Trail, and each campsite is marked with a sign similar to the one you're looking at right now. The encounter between Jared and the two fishermen was brief, but here's everything that we know. The two fishermen were simply taking a break when Jared ran up to them. I don't know what they talked about, but the fishermen did notice that there was another group of hikers 50 to 80 feet below them down the trail in the direction that Jared had run up from. The two fishermen assumed that Jared was part of this group, though it's unclear to me if they ever received verbal confirmation from Jared that he was a part of the group. After their encounter with Jared, the boy allegedly began walking rapidly up the trail adjacent to the sign marking Camp 2. It's unknown if Jared was ahead of the faster group of hikers or if he was between the faster and slower groups. It is known, however, that after Jared parted ways with the fishermen, he was never seen alive again. At some point soon after he left the fishermen, a few members of the 11-person group allegedly heard a scream off in the distance. And one of the members that heard the scream was Jared's older sister, who has put forth varying descriptions of the scream in the years since. In one article, she described the scream as playful, as in someone was gonna go tag Jared. And in another article, she described it as less playful and more like a shriek. Now, again, she was only 6 years old when this happened, and so much time has passed. And so it's understandable that a lot of the details might be hazy and her accounts might change. But one thing that has not changed in all the years since this happened is that Jared's older sister insists that she did in fact hear this scream. About 45 minutes after Jared spoke with the fishermen, the group that he was hiking with had fully come to terms with the fact that he was missing. And you might be wondering who was supposed to be responsible for watching Jared, and the truth is, we don't really know. Again, it doesn't seem like these plans were put together very well. It doesn't really seem like any one individual took the responsibility of watching the kids. It kind of just seems like everyone assumed that somebody else would be doing it, and that's how Jared was able to get away and not get noticed before he went missing. Eventually, Jared's father, Alan, was notified that Jared was missing, and he began frantically driving towards the trailhead, beating his chest and screaming, quote, "They lost my baby, they lost my baby." Alan eventually reached the trailhead, and shortly after that, the authorities were called in to launch an official search. They initially thought it was gonna be a quick process. The authorities really weren't that worried. Bill Nelson, who was with the Larimer County Sheriff's Office and in charge of the search at the time, was quoted saying, "My thought was we should be able to get in there with our people and do what we do and what we have done hundreds of times, find the person. It might take a few hours, but we would be done before midnight." Nelson retired to his pickup truck just before midnight that first night of the search, and he instructed those around him to wake him up during the night when they found Jared. But instead, he woke up by himself, much later than he anticipated, and with no news about Jared's whereabouts. By this point, it was becoming clear to Nelson as well as everyone around him that this was not going to be an ordinary search and rescue mission. But even that realization was insufficient to prepare everyone for what was about to happen next. Over 60 searchers had been deployed along the Big South Trail the evening of the day Jared went missing, and though this was a strong effort, they knew they needed more. The next morning, Sunday, October 3rd, 1999, an Air Force helicopter was brought in all the way from Cheyenne, Wyoming to scan the terrain surrounding the Big South Trail. After refueling in Fort Collins, the helicopter returned to the area, but instead of helping the search, it actually made things way more complicated and way more dangerous. The helicopter was struggling with the heavy fuel load and the dangerous mountain conditions, and it eventually stalled out and fell 100 feet down onto the Big South Trail. There were 5 people on board, but only 4 of them were able to escape the wreckage. The one man left inside of the wreckage was a Larimer County search and rescue member, Mark Sheets. Sheets was knocked unconscious during the crash. He was the only person in the helicopter who was not in a seat. He was instead sitting next to the open helicopter door, and he was not wearing a helmet, opting instead to wear a communication headset. After seeing the crash, other search and rescue members who were on the ground raced over, kicked in a window, and pulled Sheets out of the wreckage, likely saving his life. He was taken to the hospital with major injuries, but thankfully, he survived. The news media began to take notice of Jared's case after the helicopter crash, and it didn't take long for reporters, journalists, and cameramen to swarm the remote trailhead. The entire country was now watching, and the only thing search and rescue had to show for it was a downed helicopter and a nearly dead search and rescue member. They had 0 clues into what had happened to Jared, and they had no idea where he was. Day 2 of the search stretched into day 3, which stretched into day 4, and so on and so forth. Still, they had no answers, and it wasn't like they weren't trying either. Massive ground searches were being done repeatedly, divers were being called in to look in the pools of the river that ran along the trail, and planes searched far and wide from the sky. As the search continued, investigators began to consider other scenarios besides just the one of Jared getting lost in the wilderness. Could he have been abducted? Or did an animal potentially get him? That theory became a favorite among investigators because shortly into the search, mountain lion tracks were found in the area. And these tracks were found right next to small, child-sized footprints. But still, they had no proof. And eventually a week went by with no answers. And at this point, the sheriff's office decided to call off the search. Unofficial searches were still going to be allowed, but at this point, the government was done committing any of its resources to actively search for Jared. At this point, most people figured that if Jared was in fact still out there in the wilderness, it was extremely unlikely that he was still alive. Eventually, and tragically, this would be proven true, although it took nearly 4 years. Let's flash forward to June 4th, 2003. On this day, 2 businessmen from nearby Fort Collins went on a hike on the Big South Trail. The 2 men, Gary Watts and Rob Osborne, were somewhat familiar with the area and had gone on other adventures there before. In fact, on a trip they had taken a week earlier, the 2 men had discussed the mystery of Jared Ottadero, and so it was fresh on their minds as they made their way up the Big South Trail. At one point, the men found themselves in a rock field that led some 2,000 feet up off trail to a high ridge. And for whatever reason, the 2 men decided to leave the worn, gentle trail behind and began scrambling up this rock field. Now, this terrain is rough. It requires you to go slow and be very careful, pay attention with every single step that you make. Because of this, the men were very focused on the ground in front of them. And about 500 feet into their scramble, they noticed something hidden within the rocks that would have been almost impossible to see in any other circumstance. It was a child-sized white Tarzan tennis shoe. And when the men saw it, they instantly knew who it belonged to. It wasn't long before they located the other shoe and a fleece jacket and a pair of blue pants that were turned inside out. Osborne was quoted saying, "The thing is, we were up there a week earlier and talked quite a bit about the various scenarios about his," referring to Jared's, disappearance. "Then we happened upon the clothes and it's mystery solved." The two men photographed the scene, they collected some of the clothes, and then they returned to town to report what they had found. And 2 days later, staff from the Larimer County Sheriff's Office were hiking up the Big South Trail to process the scene and to look for human remains. And 11 days after that, they found a single molar tooth and a skull cap. DNA testing would soon prove what everyone suspected. The remains were that of Jared Atadero. So was this the end of the story? Was the mystery finally solved with the discovery of this clothing and the remains? Well, it depends on who you ask. My understanding is that the government did kind of officially close this case and give an explanation for what happened. However, for a lot of other people, including, as I understand it, Jared's family, the condition and location that his clothing and remains were discovered in ended up raising even more questions than it answered. Now, once again, this is a very famous case and there's tons of different theories out there about what happened. However, I narrowed it down to 3 different scenarios that I think are the most plausible. Again, I could be wrong. I'm not here to tell you which theory is most likely. I'm not here to interject my opinion. I'm just going to give you the facts as I understand them and let you make up your own mind. The first theory is the most straightforward one. Jared simply was being a kid, running around. He went off trail, he got lost, and eventually died due to hypothermia or exposure. Unfortunately, there really isn't any strong evidence that supports or contradicts this theory, but for some reason, in doing research for this video, I noticed that this theory, though it is, again, so straightforward, seems to get overlooked in online discussions about this case. Now, I don't know why that is, but it's possible that it gets overlooked because it's much more boring than these next 2 theories. The second theory, which seems to be the official theory put forth from the government, is that Jared died because of a mountain lion attack. In fact, the way that I discovered this case in the first place was because I was reading through a Wikipedia page late at night, as one does, listing known mountain lion fatalities. Now, this is the evidence supporting the mountain lion theory as I understand it. First of all, Jared's clothing that was discovered had numerous puncture marks, rips, and holes, ones that were, according to authorities, consistent with an animal attack. Also, since the location that Jared's clothing and remains were found in was 550 feet off the trail up a steep, rocky slope, it's unlikely that the 3-year-old boy could have gotten up there himself. The theory is that the mountain lion attacked him and then either dragged him up there after it killed him or before it killed him. I don't know, it just seems like really rough terrain for a 3-year-old boy to have climbed up without any assistance, for the lack of a better word. It's also worth mentioning that while mountain lion attacks on humans are extremely rare, they do happen slightly more often to small children, which is why if you're ever hiking with a child and you see a mountain lion, pick up the child as fast and as efficiently as you possibly can. Jared's death certificate lists the manner of death as, quote, undetermined probable mountain lion attack, which doesn't really sound all that confident, does it? The truth is that there's actually some evidence in this case that contradicts the official theory, the mountain lion theory. First of all, there was no blood on any of Jared's clothing, which, how would that be possible if he died via a violent attack from an animal? And also, even more suspiciously perhaps, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, Jared's pants, his blue sweatpants, were found inside out, which is just very weird. Like, how on earth would a mountain lion turn his pants inside out? And lastly, I read this in one place online, though I can't confirm it. I read that they tested Jared's clothing and did not find any trace of mountain lion DNA on it. No hairs, no blood, nothing. And this brings us to the third theory about what happened to Jared Atadero. The theory that he was killed as a result of foul play. And much of the evidence that points to this theory is simply the same evidence that contradicts the mountain lion theory. The foul play theory would explain why there was no blood on Jared's clothing. Perhaps he was taken out of the clothing before he was killed, or perhaps the blood was cleaned off the clothing. And it would also kind of explain why Jared's pants were found inside out. I mean, at the very least, it seems more likely that a human would have done that than a mountain lion. And the foul play theory could also explain why it took so many years for Jared's remains and his clothing to be found. Though the discovery was made off of the Big South Trail, my understanding is that it was basically directly above Camp 2, which was Jared's last known location. So wouldn't this area have been searched? Is it possible that his clothing and his remains were taken back up there and placed there some years later after the searching had stopped? I'm not really sure. I did read that the helicopter that crashed would have supposedly searched the area where they did eventually find the clothing and his remains. And so I don't know. Another piece of evidence that suggests foul play is that Jared's shoes were found in pretty good condition. You know, not brand new, obviously, but not the kind of condition you'd expect after they had sat in the wilderness through 4 Colorado winters. So maybe this theory is true, maybe it's not. I don't know. We don't have any suspects. Nobody's ever been named publicly as a person of interest. So maybe it was a murder or an abduction. Maybe it was a mountain lion, or maybe it was something that I didn't even cover in this video. The unfortunate reality is that we don't and likely never will know the truth about what happened to Jared Ottadero. It's a really sad story. It's a scary one, and my heart goes out to Jared and, of course, his family. This is very unlikely, but there will be thousands of people that watch this video. So just on the tiny off chance that you happen to know something about this case that hasn't been reported, please speak up and say something and get Jared's family the answers that they deserve.
YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy watching this video next, so go give it a watch right now. And thank you all so much. Like, seriously, you know, it's just been so crazy on this channel. Thank you all so much for supporting my content.